Chapter 3483. In the studio. A few staff members swarmed into the studio. Some pulled up the red curtain, some wiped the stools, and some mopped the floor until the entire studio was spotless. They walked to the door with obsequious expressions and bowed to Gu Jinglian. "Mr. Gu, please come in." Please come in." Gu Jinglian tugged at his tie and walked in. Chu Ho looked at them from the corner of her eyes. She was doubting her life. Were these staff members really the same people who had treated her so elegantly and coldly in the morning? Why did they suddenly change their attitude? Chu Ho walked in with a suspicious expression. She saw the staff members respectfully escorting Gu Jinglian to the stool like a servant. They turned around and smiled politely at Chu Ho. Her face instantly wrinkled into a chrysanthemum. Could they be more normal? She felt a chill run down her spine. Chu Ho walked awkwardly to Gu Jinglian's side and sat down. The staff member walked to the back of the camera and glanced at the lens. She smiled and said, "Sit closer." Chu Ho instantly had goosebumps all over her body. She leaned closer to Gu Jinglian. "Can I?" The staff member glanced at the camera again. She felt that Gu Jinglian was about to go out of the frame. "Sir, come closer." Gu Jinglian looked at her coldly and slowly moved towards Chu Ho. "Come closer." Gu Jinglian moved a little more. "Be more intimate. It looks very distant." The man should put his arm on the woman's shoulder. It's more natural. Gu Jinglian raised his arm and pulled Chu Ho to his side. Chu Ho was speechless. The staff member was speechless. Gu Jinglian said impatiently, "Hurry up and take the photos." Yes. The staff member nodded his head like he was pounding garlic and took a few photos with a click 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 sound. When the photos were developed, they were taken directly to make a certificate. When Chu Ho received the marriage certificate, in the photo, Gu Jinglian had one arm around her shoulder. He looked extremely domineering. There was no expression on his face. He did not have the joy of other newlyweds, nor did he have a trace of a smile. His face was cold from beginning to end. At the very least, she curled the corners of her mouth slightly. Although her smile wasn't obvious, it wasn't so stiff. Forget it. It was just a certificate. Even after returning home, it would be locked in the drawer to collect dust. Chu Ho walked over to Gu Jinglian and handed him a red document. "Here, it's yours. 2 portions. Yes, one for the man and one for the woman." Chu Ho looked at the time and quickly said, "Okay, I'm ready to go to work." After that, she ignored Gu Jinglian and left in a hurry after saying goodbye to Uncle Fu. Gu Jinglian looked at the marriage certificate in his hand and flipped it open. In the photo, the two of them looked awkward but intimate. This was the first time he had taken such a photo with a woman. This woman was now officially his wife. There was an extremely strange and awkward feeling that inexplicably arose spontaneously. Uncle Fu walked over and saw Gu Jinglian staring at the photo on the marriage certificate. He quietly asked, "Master, shall we go home?" His voice broke his train of thought. Gu Jinglian looked up and handed the certificate to him. "You're in charge of keeping it." Uncle Fu took the marriage certificate like it was a treasure. He flipped it open and looked at it. He was instantly beaming with joy. Gu Jinglian suddenly warned coldly, "No one is allowed to see it. Do you hear me?" Chapter 3484. In this country, there was no such thing as mercenaries. Any mercenaries were illegal to exist. Only in other countries, especially in war-torn areas, there were mercenary groups with extremely impressive backgrounds. Chu Ho asked back, "What's so strange about that? Aren't you afraid of death?" "If I was afraid of death, I wouldn't have engaged in such a profession. However, being afraid of death doesn't mean that I want to die. Everyone wants to live well. If you don't want to live, it's easier to commit suicide by jumping into the river. Becoming a mercenary was to survive. Mercenaries had a high salary and a considerable income. Generally, taking on a mission, the salary started at 100,000 yuan. In that era, it was definitely beyond the reach of many people. Logically speaking, after so many years, Chu-ho should have accumulated a lot of wealth. She had indeed accumulated a lot of wealth. In the mercenary career that lasted for more than 3 years, she had accumulated a few million yuan in assets. However, other than her daily expenses and the apartment she bought in San Francisco, she later donated everything to a refugee charity. When she was in Interpol, her salary was much lower than when she was a mercenary. Later, after she went missing, the organization must have thought that she was dead, so they might have cancelled her account. She didn't miss that little bit of assets. It was also difficult for Chu-ho to talk about the past. For some reason, after getting the marriage certificate today, she inexplicably felt a lot of emotions. In the past, she didn't even dare to think that she would one day live such a stable life. She had a husband in name, children, and a complete family. Things that she didn't even dare to dream of had happened. Maybe it has something to do with the situation when I was young. Chu-ho looked out of the window, but her expression was very calm. Since I was young, the country I was born in was filled with countless wars and disputes. When I was young, I experienced a very big change. My family was destroyed and I was homeless. I boarded a humanitarian rescue ship from the United States and safely arrived at the pure land of the United States. In the beginning, I became a mercenary because I wanted revenge. Revenge? I wanted to become stronger and then maintain peace. When I became strong enough, I would kill those enemies with my own hands. However, when I grew up, I realized that the rebel organization that destroyed my family had long been eliminated. Thus, this wish became the wish to maintain world peace. As Chu-ho spoke, he was amused by the childish thoughts of his youth. He actually had such a childish childhood. Isn't it funny? When I was young, being a mercenary was a sacred profession in my eyes. That's because in many war-torn countries, in addition to the peacekeeping forces, the ones fighting against many rebel groups are mercenaries dispatched by the government. I was rescued from the flames of war by a mercenary. At that time, I thought that when I grew up, I must become such a brave person. However, when she grew up, she realized that the world was actually so complicated. It was not as simple as she had imagined. It was the law of the jungle. The weak were destined to have no place to survive. Those organizations that had originally judged the government were only resisting because of the government's incompetence and misuse of power. As for the troops who claimed to be righteous, most of them were just invaders for the sake of the country's own interests or for the sake of the local oil and natural gas resources. Chapter 3485. In this world, there's no such thing as absolute justice or absolute evil. There's only the strong and the weak. Chu-ho said slowly, maybe what I'm saying sounds funny, but maybe the absolute justice in your eyes is just self-interest and a high-sounding doctrine. Li Xiaofeng stared at her blankly, unable to digest what she had said. Chu-ho noticed that he kept looking at her and couldn't help but feel strange. What's wrong? Nothing. It's just that this is the first time I've heard someone say that. Li Xiaofeng shook his head and sighed. Maybe it's just as you said, there's no such thing as absolute justice in this world. He changed the topic and asked, then why did you leave Interpol? Ah. Interpol is the most authoritative organization for justice. I heard that you used to be the top anti-crime inspector. Why did you come here and become a lowly police officer? Chu-ho pursed her lips and said, I just went with the flow. When Gu Jinglian came back from the company, he had just stepped through the door when he vaguely heard a few of his subordinates standing at the side and discussing. I didn't expect old master to be so photogenic. Even if it's a celebrity photo, it doesn't look good. But Sister Chu looks a little chubby in the photo. Luckily, she's too skinny, so she looks better in front of the camera. You didn't see how happy Uncle Fu was today. Now that old master and Sister Chu are married, he can finally get rid of one of his worries. The two men were cleaning the courtyard and discussing excitedly. As they were cleaning, they suddenly caught sight of a pair of exquisite leather shoes. The two men's expressions changed and they followed the pair of slender legs. Gu Jinglian's gloomy and handsome face came into view. The two men's eyelids twitched violently and the corners of their lips twitched for a while. They stood upright awkwardly and gave a flattering smile. Old master. Ha! You're back. Ha! Gu Jinglian glanced at them and asked coldly, where did you see the photo? It's the photo on old master's marriage certificate. Halfway through their words, the two of them didn't dare to continue. This was because they saw Gu Jinglian's face getting darker and darker. Uncle Fu. Gu Jinglian went upstairs and kicked open the door of the study. Uncle Fu was wiping the table carefully. He was so shocked by the loud noise that the cloth almost flew away. Uncle Fu turned around. He was so frightened by Gu Jinglian's aggressive look that he hiccuped and stammered, Master. He eagerly went up to greet him. Hee, you're back. Gu Jinglian's face was livid as he grabbed his collar and glared at him. He gritted his teeth and asked, where's the marriage certificate? Yes, it's in your drawer. Didn't I tell you not to show it to others? Gu Jinglian leaned closer to him and asked coldly, are you ignoring me? F***ck. He had been betrayed. Who was the shameless blabbermouth? Didn't he warn him to keep it a secret? I kept it well. Uncle Fu immediately put on a stern face and said righteously, it must have been someone who secretly looked at it. Gu Jinglian narrowed his eyes. You mean those people lined up to sneak into the study to look at it? Uncle Fu was speechless. Someone please come and save him. Chapter 3486. Dad. You're back. Xiao Bao skipped into the room and hugged Gu Jinglian's thigh tightly. When Uncle Fu heard Xiao Bao's voice, he was so moved that tears and snot flowed down his face. He was practically an angel. He had rescued him from the abyss of suffering in an instant. Xiao Bao's appearance somewhat diverted Gu Jinglian's attention. Uncle Fu carefully pried Gu Jinglian's fingers away from his collar. Then, he took half a step back dejectedly. Just as he picked up the rag from the floor, he heard Xiao Bao say excitedly, Dad, Uncle Fu showed me your and Mom's marriage certificate. The photo is so beautiful. The main thing is that Dad is handsome and Mom is beautiful. Wow! It's so perfect. They were a perfect match. When Uncle Fu heard this, he was stunned as if he had been struck by lightning. Behind him, Gu Jinglian's face darkened. His sinister voice sounded as if it came from hell. Uncle Fu. Whoosh. He did not know how such an old man could be so nimble. He actually slipped away in an instant, as if there was oil on the soles of his feet. Gu Jinglian was so angry that he clenched his fists. However, he saw Xiao Bao walk in front of him and open his arms to ask for a hug. Hug. He acted coquettishly and asked for a hug and love. Gu Jinglian's expression softened a little. He bent down slightly and picked him up. Little Bao held his father's face in his hands and kissed him on both cheeks. Daddy is so obedient. Dad is so great. Gu Jinglian was speechless. What the hell? This was the first time he had been praised by someone with such a strange word like good. And he was only a 6-year-old child. Gu Jinglian carried him to the sofa. His eyes were very gloomy, very gloomy. When he thought about how his warning to Uncle Fu had been ignored by that old man, he couldn't help but feel angry. I told him to take good care of it and not let anyone see it, but he actually came back and passed it around. Seeing his gloomy face, Xiaobao patted his face with his little hand. Daddy, what's wrong? He seemed to be very unhappy. Today is a joyous day, don't put on such a long face. Big day. Gu Jinglian grabbed his hand and warned him coldly, don't hit Dad's face. Why? Very disrespectful. Xiaobao nodded as if he understood. Then, he puffed out his chest and said righteously, Daddy, you're not allowed to hit my head from now on. Xiaobao said seriously, because that's also very disrespectful. Pa, Gu Jinglian smacked him on the head. Xiaobao immediately hugged his head and said angrily, what are you doing? Asking for a beating. How am I asking for a beating? Did I say something wrong? Gu Jinglian reminded him, when will you be my father? Only then will it be your turn to educate me. Xiaobao looked like a little adult and muttered angrily, I want to be your father, but unfortunately, I don't have the chance. However, if I really have a disobedient son like you, I will definitely be angry and my life will be shortened. Gu Jinglian was speechless. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists, resisting the urge to hit him. Xiaobao said again, you don't know how to cherish such a cute son like me. You have to know that being my father is a blessing that you've accumulated over several lifetimes. Gu Jinglian was speechless. He suddenly pinched Xiaobao's chubby cheeks and said coldly, if you talk nonsense again, I'll hit you. Chapter 3487. The father and son held on tightly to each other as they ravaged each other. However, Xiaobao was obviously at a disadvantage. His chubby little fingers were not as long as Gu Jinglian's, nor were they as strong as his. After a while, Gu Jinglian did not feel anything, but he felt like his face was about to be torn apart. Torn. Torn. It hurts. Xiaobao protested pitifully, don't pinch anymore, sob. Don't pinch anymore, Gu Jinglian frowned. He grabbed his chubby cheeks and played with them. Yes, it felt good. Just like a glutinous rice bowl. Xiaobao was Xiaobao. He might as well change his name to Little Bun. The chubby baby fat was so pleasing to the touch that Gu Jinglian could not help but relax his brows. Even the knot in his heart disappeared. However, Xiaobao, who was being ravaged in his hands, was suffering unspeakably. He punched and hit like an angry cat, using his hands and feet to protest. Gu Jinglian finally let go of him. Xiaobao covered his face in pain. He looked like a storm was coming, as if a dam was about to burst. Gu Jinglian casually picked up the afternoon snack and stuffed it into his mouth. Xiaobao was speechless. He licked it with his tongue and the pain on his face disappeared immediately. He said in surprise, wow, it's so sweet. The child's face was indeed like the weather in June, changing as quickly as it wanted. Xiaobao looked at the snacks on the coffee table. These were pastries that Uncle Fu had prepared in advance. Gu Jinglian casually stuffed them into his mouth. They were rose pastries. It was Xiaobao's first time eating such delicious snacks. He reached out to take them. Slap. Gu Jinglian slapped his hand away. Xiaobao retracted his hand in pain and glared at him fiercely. Then, he reached out to take them again. Slap. You're not allowed to eat them. Gu Jinglian refused coldly, they're mine. Stingy brat. Xiaobao sat down on the carpet and hugged his arms with an aggrieved expression. Gu Jinglian picked up the pastry, pinched a rose pastry with his long fingers, and took a bite. He then looked at Xiaobao, only to see a certain guy with a greedy expression, almost drooling. You want to eat? Yes, yes. Xiaobao quickly nodded, expressing his position. Gu Jinglian suddenly curled his lips and said slowly, that depends on whether you have the ability to eat it. Uncle Fu had just finished tidying up the other rooms. When he passed by the study, he casually pushed open the door and saw Gu Jinglian sitting leisurely on the sofa. He casually picked up a piece of rose pastry and then casually threw it out like a parabola. Xiao Bao immediately straightened his neck and opened his mouth wide to receive the rose crisp. Ah woo! After experiencing 2 failures, he was amazed this time. First, he predicted where Gu Jinglian would throw the rose pastry. As such, as soon as the rose pastry was thrown, he reacted in time and leaned over. With his mouth open, he caught the rose pastry steadily. Gu Jinglian praised generously, beautiful. Xiao Bao was extremely pleased. He puffed out his chest and looked very proud. Uncle Fu was petrified. Dad, am I awesome? Xiao Bao lay on his lap with an expression that said, come and praise me, come and praise me. If he had a tail, it would be wagging vigorously at this moment. Gu Jinglian patted his head, yes, you're awesome. Hee hee. Xiao Bao caught a glimpse of Uncle Fu from the corner of his eye and immediately turned to Uncle Fu, saying, Uncle Fu, come and play with us. This game is very fun. Chapter 3488. Uncle Fu immediately cleared his throat and said, I still have something to do. With that, he turned around and slipped away. Uncle Fu was about to teach those little rascals a lesson. How dare they bring up the matter of him circulating Old Master's marriage certificate in front of Old Master. Now that he had offended Old Master, he wouldn't dare to show his face in front of him for a few days. Uncle Fu closed the door behind him. Gu Jinglian turned around and saw Xiao Bao looking at him expectantly. Let's continue playing. Let's continue playing. This game is so fun. It was much more fun than playing video games. More importantly, no matter what game it was, as long as he could play it with Gu Jinglian, Xiao Bao felt that it was a lot of fun. He really enjoyed the time he spent with Gu Jinglian. No matter how boring the game was, he still found it interesting. Gu Jinglian said calmly, no. Why? Xiao Bao was greatly disappointed. He shrugged his head and said pitifully, why don't you play? Dad has something to do. Oh, Xiao Bao knew how to read people's expressions and was very tactful. Hence, he muttered, then I'll look for Uncle Fu to play. As he said this, he stood up and ran to look for Uncle Fu with a bowl of rose pastries in his hand. Gu Jinglian suddenly stood up and walked slowly to the desk. Suddenly, he thought of something and quietly pulled open the drawer. In the drawer, there was a red marriage certificate on top of a pile of account books. The 3 words stamped in gold on it were so eye-catching. Gu Jinglian sat down on the chair and casually picked up the marriage certificate. He gently flipped it open and a photo of him and Chu Ho came into view. In the photo, he was holding Chu Ho's shoulder and looking at the camera. His face was cold and his dark eyes were deep and unfathomable. So, this was how he looked in other people's eyes. Gu Jinglian subconsciously reached out and touched his face. He was a little surprised. He rarely looked at himself in the mirror, so from the photo, one could clearly see that his calm face was actually so cold. No wonder Xiao Bao kept avoiding him when they were in the Gu family. He seemed to be very afraid of him. Beside him, Chu Ho was clearly caught off guard when he was suddenly pulled to his side. However, he had to cooperate and smile, but his smile was very awkward. He smiled awkwardly. She was even a little reluctant. Unwilling or unwilling. Gu Jinglian could not help but narrow his eyes. His gaze fell on Chu Ho's awkward face in the photo, and he felt inexplicably unhappy. He was so engrossed that he did not notice the footsteps outside the door. Chu Ho had just pushed the door open when he saw Gu Jinglian holding the marriage certificate and staring at it. His lips could not help but twitch a few times. The marriage certificate is so beautiful. Before he finished speaking, the man who was engrossed in his thoughts was immediately alerted. Gu Jinglian instinctively closed the marriage certificate and threw it into the drawer. He looked at Chu Ho and frowned as he questioned, "Who let you in?" He meant, why didn't you knock before coming in? Chu Ho crossed her arms and gestured at the half-closed door. The door wasn't closed. I thought there was no one inside. Gu Jinglian was speechless. Chu Ho saw that he was a little unhappy that he had been caught red-handed and thought it was funny. I saw you staring at the marriage certificate the moment I came in. Why? What's so beautiful on it? As she spoke, she leaned over to see if there was any difference between his marriage certificate and hers. Gu Jinglian pushed the drawer to block her probing gaze. Chapter 3489. Chu Ho frowned. What are you doing? Guarding against thieves. Where's your marriage certificate? Gu Jinglian looked up and suddenly asked, take it out. Why? She stared at him warily. However, when he mentioned the marriage certificate, she suddenly remembered. She touched her pocket and realized that the marriage certificate seemed to have been kept in the drawer in the office and she had forgotten to bring it back. She blinked awkwardly. When Gu Jinglian saw this, he couldn't help but feel suspicious. Where's the marriage certificate? I forgot. You forgot. How could she forget such an important thing? Chu Ho explained, I think it's in the drawer in the office. I forgot to take it. Gu Jinglian was speechless. His face darkened, and he was obviously unhappy. Chu Ho touched the back of her head and said nonchalantly, anyway, it's not something important. What do you want it for? Something not important? Gu Jinglian repeated her words and his face darkened. He suddenly got up and approached her. The displeasure in his eyes was almost obvious. Chu Ho retreated slightly until her back was against the wall. She had nowhere else to go. She looked at Gu Jinglian warily and continued, could it be something important? Anyway, it's in the drawer. No one will steal it. Gu Jinglian stared at her unkindly. After a long time, he curved his lips coldly and smiled coldly. Not important. Important. If Chu Ho still couldn't read his expression, she would have wasted all her years as a police officer. However, she couldn't understand. She had just left a marriage certificate behind. Why did he look so unhappy? She really couldn't think of what was so important about a marriage certificate. Gu Jinglian looked at her and said coldly, what are your thoughts on marrying me? This was a primary school student's summer homework. What was the point of writing down her thoughts after watching a movie? The only thought she had was, so troublesome. As soon as she said that, Gu Jinglian's expression became even colder. Trouble. I thought that getting a marriage certificate should be a very simple procedure. I didn't expect it to be so troublesome and take up so much of my time. Chu Ho grumbled unhappily, you made me so late this afternoon. I guess I'm going to lose my perfect attendance award this month. The coldness in Gu Jinglian's eyes seemed to stab her. Chu Ho felt that something was amiss and asked suspiciously, Gu Jinglian, what's wrong with you? You look like you want to eat someone. Gu Jinglian looked at her for a long time, then suddenly snorted and left. Chu Ho stared speechlessly at his back. After a long while, he grumbled, what's wrong with him? You're crazy. During dinner. For some reason, Xiao Bao was in a particularly good mood. Perhaps it was because he had finally gotten rid of one of his worries, so much so that his appetite became vigorous. He finished 2 bowls of rice in one go. Chu Ho glanced at him and saw him raise his bowl to Uncle Fu and say cheerfully, another bowl. You're not allowed to eat anymore. Chu Ho quickly said, you've already eaten 2 bowls today. If he ate any more, his little stomach would burst. Xiao Bao pursed his lips, feeling wronged. Uncle Fu also said, Xiao Bao, be good. Let's call it a day. Overeating was not good for a child's development. Uncle Fu also had his own concerns. Xiao Bao then put down his bowl and turned his head. Seeing that Gu Jinglian had also finished eating, he immediately asked, Dad, have you finished eating too? Gu Jinglian did not say anything. Chapter 3490. Chu-hee thought to herself, don't tell me he's still angry. Although she didn't know what he was angry about. This man had always been unpredictable. For some reason, Xiao Bao was especially enthusiastic. His eyes darted around and he said, it's getting late. Daddy, hurry up and take a shower. Let's go to bed early. Chu Ho reminded him kindly, Xiao Bao, it's only 6:30. It's getting late. Gu Jinglian glanced at him and threw the bowl and chopsticks on the table. Then he got up and went upstairs. Seeing that he had succeeded, Xiao Bao turned to Chu Ho and encouraged her, Mommy, it's getting late. You should go to bed early too. Chu Ho was speechless. It was only 6:30. She couldn't fall asleep so early, right? However, Chu Ho had no choice but to stand up and head upstairs after being urged by Xiao Bao. Xiao Bao immediately followed behind and saw that Chu Ho was carrying a blanket and was about to enter Xiao Bao's room. He rushed over and blocked the door, saying righteously, you're not allowed to enter. Chu Ho rolled her eyes. What are you doing? Mommy, you seem to have forgotten what Xiao Bao said. Xiao Bao cleared his throat and said seriously, Xiao Bao said that he wants to sleep alone. This is independence. Mommy, please respect Xiao Bao. Respect, Chu Ho almost bit her tongue. Whoa. This was incredible. After attending kindergarten, this guy actually knew what respect was. If I don't sleep here, where should I sleep? Xiao Bao rolled his eyes as well. Mommy, you have a husband now. Of course, you should sleep with your husband. I've seen other people's parents sleeping together at night. Chu Ho said. Why are you so enthusiastic about asking me to sleep with your father? What are you up to? I don't care, I don't care. Anyway, I don't want my mother to sleep with me. After Xiao Bao finished speaking, he slammed the door shut, leaving Chu Ho alone outside. Xiao Bao. Chu Ho kicked the door angrily. I'll give you 3 seconds to open the door. 2. Before he could finish counting, he heard a click. The door was locked from the inside. Chu Ho, was this brat asking for a beating? There was a stalemate outside the door for a few minutes. No matter how Chu Ho tried to persuade or coerce him, Xiao Bao still had no intention of opening the door. Left with no choice, Chu Ho hugged her quilt and walked to Gu Jinglian's door. Seeing that the door was ajar, she peeked through the crack and saw a dark shadow appear at the door. The door was pulled open from within. Gu Jinglian stood at the door in a bathrobe and looked at her coldly. Their eyes met. It was extremely awkward. Chu Ho sat up awkwardly and hugged her quilt. Embarrassed, she said, tonight. I'll have to sleep on your sofa. She didn't dare to look at Gu Jinglian's expression. She thought that in the next second, some demon king would slam the door again and lock her outside. However, Gu Jinglian walked away expressionlessly, leaving the door open. Chu Ho walked in with her quilt and saw that the man had returned to the sofa. He was fiddling with his hair. He had just taken a shower and his hair was still wet. However, he didn't have the habit of using a hairdryer, so he waited for his hair to dry naturally. Taking advantage of this time, he had the habit of reading. Only then did Chu-hee realize that his entire wall was filled with books. Generally speaking, some people's books were just empty shells used for decoration. Chapter 3491. She did not expect him to like reading. Gu Jinglian seemed to have noticed that she was constantly looking at him and could not help but look up suspiciously. She immediately reacted and retreated to the side. She walked into the cloakroom and started to look for her pajamas. After taking the pajamas, she walked into the bathroom and locked the door. She did not have the habit of locking the door, but since they were sharing a room, she decided to be on the safe side and locked the door from the inside. When she walked out of the bathroom feeling refreshed, Chu-ho had just walked into the study room. She planned to continue sleeping on the sofa for the night and settle the score with that fellow tomorrow. However, she saw Gu Jinglian leaning lazily on the sofa with his arms crossed and his eyes closed. She did not know if he was closing his eyes to take a nap or if he had already fallen asleep. He actually took over her territory. What happened to her sleeping on the sofa? How could he take it for himself just like that? The corners of Chu-ho's lips twitched. She walked in front of him and bent down to size him up. Gu Jinglian, she raised her voice again. Gu Jinglian. Chu-ho stood up speechlessly. It turned out that he had really fallen asleep. However, this man had always been alert. No matter how she called him, he did not wake up. He slept like a dead pig. Could he be pretending to be asleep? Chu-ho reached out and snapped her fingers a few times in front of him. However, Gu Jinglian still had his eyes closed and did not react at all. His long eyelashes intertwined quietly. When he closed his eyes, his long eyelashes were immediately obvious. He was actually charming and attractive. He was like a living portrait of a beauty. Chu-ho touched her chin and narrowed her eyes to size him up. Gu Jinglian's facial features were definitely top-notch. However, Chu-ho was not born to be in love. She was also not a member of the Appearance Association. Even if Gu Jinglian had his eyes closed, no matter how shockingly handsome he was, it could not move her at all. She did not even feel a ripple in her heart. She was somewhat face-blind. To be precise, no matter how good Gu Jinglian looked, he was about the same level as Li Xiaofeng. Looking at his sleeping face, Chu-ho only had one thought: his eyelashes were really long. Forget it. If you want to sleep on the sofa, I'll give it to you, okay? Chu-ho muttered to himself. He tossed the quilt over him and turned to walk into the bedroom. Lying on the spacious bed, Chu-ho stretched his limbs, feeling extremely satisfied. God, this bed is too comfortable, right? It was softer than the bed in Xiao Bao's room. Gu Jinglian's bed was made of high-quality Simmons mattresses with a full set of memory cotton bedding. The feeling of lying on it was neither soft nor hard. The softness was just right, wrapping around the entire line of his back. It was incomparably fitting. After lying down, he was reluctant to move. Chu-ho stretched out his 10 fingers in satisfaction. She hugged the pillow to her chest, closed her eyes, and soon fell asleep. Although she was a light sleeper, she could fall asleep very quickly. It could be said that she had a rather strange physique. Gu Jinglian once commented that sometimes she was as smart as a god, but sometimes she was simple-minded. In just a few minutes, she fell asleep soundly. In the study, a night light was on. On the sofa, the man suddenly opened his deep eyes. Gu Jinglian opened his eyes and saw that the wall lamp in the bedroom was still on. He suddenly got up. Chapter 3492. Speaking of this, Gu Jinglian was especially displeased. This woman had always avoided his bed as if she found it dirty and avoided him like a snake or a scorpion. Was he a scourge or a ferocious beast? Gu Jinglian walked into the bedroom and saw Chu-ho hugging a pillow under the dim light, dominating more than half of the space. This bed was specially custom-made. It was 3 meters wide and 3 meters long. Even such a big bed did not look big enough for her to toss and turn. This woman's sleeping posture was terrible. He gave such an evaluation, walked to the head of the bed, and slowly sat down on his side. The soft bed sank in an instant. Gu Jinglian lowered his head and looked at Chu-ho's sleeping face. His eyes could not help but darken a little. She was wearing pajamas. Because her sleeping posture was too casual, her slender legs were exposed to the air. Her snow-white skin looked like jade porcelain under the wall lamp. Her eyes were tightly shut. On her fair and flawless skin, her eyelashes were black, and her lips were red. Her black hair was scattered on the pillow, but there was a kind of magnificent beauty. She used to be so thin that her cheeks were slightly sunken. However, Uncle Fu had been taking good care of her recently. He fed her fish and meat, and she had finally put on some weight. Her palm-sized face was not as thin as before, and she looked haggard. However, his gaze fell on the distinct joints of her collarbone. It was too deep. This meant that she was still a little too thin with her current appearance. Chu-ho closed her eyes quietly and let out soft breathing sounds that were almost inaudible. She slept peacefully, so her beauty at that time could be seen without any hindrance. Gu Jinglian's eyes could not help but darken a little. His body actually reacted a little. How long had it been since he had a woman? Looking at her like this, it was as if some kind of consciousness was quietly awakening. Gu Jinglian could not help but reach out and gently push the hair hanging on her neck to the side. When his cold fingertips touched her skin, Chu-ho shuddered and suddenly opened her eyes. She had just opened her eyes and met his deep almond-shaped eyes. Because of this, her originally hazy consciousness was suddenly awakened. You! What are you doing? Before she could finish speaking, Gu Jinglian leaned down. His tall body followed his movements and covered her under his dark shadow. Chu-ho was so frightened that her tongue was almost tied. Even her breathing was not smooth. Gu Jinglian, what are you doing? Sleeping. His cold words made Chu-ho turn pale with shock. You're not sleeping on the sofa? Did I say that I'll sleep on the sofa? He retorted, silencing the woman. He did not say that. However, just now Chu-ho squinted her eyes suspiciously. Were you pretending to be asleep just now? When he should be smart, he was not smart. When he should not be smart, he was very smart. Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows. Since we're husband and wife, what's wrong with sleeping on the same bed? Husband and wife. Chu-ho sneered. We've just registered our marriage. Does that make us husband and wife? Does it not? Chu-ho flew into a rage out of humiliation. Gu Jinglian, don't forget. Why did we register our marriage? You don't have to remind me. Chapter 3493. Gu Jinglian moved closer to her. His tall nose was almost touching her cheek. His hot breath kept brushing against her skin. His calm and masculine breathing was audible to her ears. Chu-ho was speechless. What are you trying to do? You really don't know, or are you pretending not to know? Gu Jinglian's long fingers gently brushed against her lips. His eyes sparkled. Of course, I'm fulfilling my duty as a husband. Chu-ho was thankful that there was no water in her mouth. Otherwise, she would have spat it out. Duty? She mumbled, what duty do you have to fulfill? Before she could finish her sentence, Gu Jinglian suddenly lowered his head and covered her slightly open mouth with his slightly cold lips. Almost without any hesitation, he broke through the barrier between her lips and teeth. Chu-ho widened her eyes in shock. He suddenly kissed her, leaving her no room to react. What was he doing? He was actually kissing her. Gu Jinglian, who had always been obsessed with cleanliness, was actually kissing her on the lips. In such a state of shock, she did not react immediately until she felt the warmth of his palm on her back. Chu-ho pushed him away fiercely. However, just as she pushed his body away, Gu Jinglian continued to press down on her. It was as if he had already expected her resistance. Before Chu-ho could punch his face, he quickly held her back with one hand. Chu-ho was instantly embarrassed and angry. She struggled, but he held her down so tightly that she had no room to resist. Let go! She shouted angrily and bent her knees to hit his vital parts. Gu Jinglian did not care about her tricks at all and used his legs to suppress her. In this way, she had no room to struggle at all. Gu Jinglian, she gritted her teeth, and her eyes were filled with hatred and anger. Gu Jinglian said slowly, "It seems that you didn't suffer enough 6 years ago." Suffer? Chu Ho furrowed his brows and glared at her. Gu Jinglian smirked coldly and whispered into her ear, "You're no match for me in terms of skills." His breath was like orchids, and when his breath brushed against her ear, she couldn't help but become extremely sensitive. She shivered, and all the pores on her body opened up. "Gu Jinglian, I'm warning you. If you dare to touch me today," the man interrupted her. "You should know me." Chu Ho stared at him suspiciously. However, she heard him say word by word, "I hate this kind of provocation the most." After saying that, he lowered his body. He was only one step away from conquering the city. Chu Ho resisted fiercely, but he couldn't break free from his powerful grip. Gu Jinglian said, "Didn't we do it once 6 years ago? You don't have to be so pretentious." Before Chu Ho could say anything, he felt a strange sensation and broke out in cold sweat. When the first ray of morning light shone in, Chu Ho was awakened by the glaring rays of the morning sun. She frowned and woke up. She opened her eyes and regained consciousness. Immediately, she felt the pain in her body clearly transmitted through her nerve endings. She had always been sensitive to pain, but her pain threshold was very high. She had once suffered a serious injury and a bullet pierced through her arm, but she still relied on her willpower to walk through the tropical rainforest. However, the pain in her body now was not like the injuries she had suffered in the past. Chapter 3494. Everything that had happened last night was more like a smoke-filled war. She struggled to prop herself up and get off the bed. The moment her toes touched the ground, the pain on her thighs became more obvious. "This damned man," Chu Ho cursed viciously in her heart. When she walked into the bathroom earlier, her body was reflected in the mirror. Her pajamas were torn apart and her shoulders drooped. Her originally fair and smooth skin was mottled with many densely packed bite marks. They were not hickeys, but bite marks. They looked like the marks left by poisonous insects and were extremely messy. Other than the bite marks, there were also some bruises. These were the marks left behind by her resistance. Gu Jinglian had tamed her as if she was a proud and aloof lion. Even though she kept resisting, she had to admit that compared to Gu Jinglian's skills, she was really vulnerable. Who would have thought that such a secretive man would be able to suppress her so easily with just one hand? Chu Ho unwillingly changed out of her pajamas and endured the pain. She took a hot shower, changed her clothes, and walked out of the door. However, she unexpectedly bumped into Uncle Fu, who was passing by. "Chu Ho, morning." Before the word, "ah," could leave his mouth, Uncle Fu saw that there was an extremely ambiguous mark on her exposed neck. It was red and mottled, and it immediately made his imagination run wild. He thought about how she and Gu Jinglian were in the same room last night, and then he thought about how Old Master also had an eye-catching red mark on his neck when he went out this morning. Even though he did not dare to take a closer look, it was not difficult to imagine how this mark was left behind. When Uncle Fu thought about how Old Master had conquered Chu Ho last night, the joy in his heart almost burst out from his eyes. He resisted the urge to cheer and pretended to be reserved. "You're awake. Do you want to eat breakfast?" Chu Ho saw that although he was pretending to be calm, his eyes kept glancing at her neck. She instinctively reacted. Could there be some strange mark on the part of her neck that was not covered by her clothes? She immediately covered it with her hands, but it was a little too obvious. Uncle Fu almost could not hold back his laughter. He wanted to hold it in, but the corners of his mouth were raised to the sky. "Ah. Xiao Bao is awake and eating breakfast. Where's Gu Jinglian?" Chu Ho could not restrain her anger as she clenched her fists and said angrily, "Where is he?" "Old Master," went out early in the morning. Cow. Chu-ho could not help but curse. She was embarrassed and angry, like a volcano that was about to erupt. Uncle Fu kindly and reminded her, "You're eating breakfast. I heard your stomach grumble a few times. Are you hungry?" She must have exhausted all her energy from last night's torment. Now that she woke up late, she must be starving. She could not help but glared at him. Uncle Fu. Yes. What are you gloating about? She questioned him angrily. What do you mean? Uncle Fu immediately said sternly, "Is that so?" "I'm not gloating." How could he say that he was not gloating? The corners of his mouth were raised so high that a soy sauce bottle could be hung from it. Uncle Fu chuckled and said, "Hurry up and come down for breakfast." However, this old man disappeared from her sight within 3 seconds. Chapter 3495. Chu-ho asked, "What are you guys whispering about?" Xiao Bao immediately sat up straight and tried to hold back his laughter. Uncle Fu immediately stood to the side and didn't say anything. Chu-ho walked over and glanced at them warily. Then she walked to the dining table and casually took a sandwich and milk. She said, "I'm going to work. It's getting late. Don't be late for school." With that, Chu-ho left. Just as she left, Xiao Bao stood up excitedly and said to Uncle Fu, "Really? Of course it's true." Uncle Fu said happily, "Who knows, maybe your mom will give birth to a little brother for you soon." When Xiao Bao heard this, he didn't feel too good about it. Uncle Fu looked at his expression and saw that he was reluctant. He was a little surprised and asked, "What's wrong?" "Xiao Bao, aren't you happy that mom is giving you a little brother?" Xiao Bao said unhappily, "I want a little sister." "A little sister?" Uncle Fu was a little surprised. "Wouldn't it be great to have a little brother? That way, he can play with you." "I want a little sister who's as cute as Xiao Bao pouted and said, "A little sister would be so cute." When Uncle Fu heard this, he said, "It doesn't matter if it's a little brother or a little sister, I'll like them both." "Of course." Xiao Bao added, "As long as it's from mom and dad, it doesn't matter if it's a little sister or a little brother. In the future, I'll be an older brother." Just as Uncle Fu and Xiao Bao were immersed in the beautiful yearning of a little brother and a little sister, before going to work, Chu-ho went to the pharmacy to buy a morning after pill. She drank the bottle of purified water that she had bought. After doing some calculations, Chu-he was still worried even though it was the safe period. This damned guy, did he take the wrong medicine last night and lose his mind? Chu-ho had just arrived at the police station and was sitting in his seat when he suddenly thought of something. He pulled open the drawer and saw that the marriage certificate was still lying in the drawer. He closed the drawer again. In the afternoon, she received orders from her superiors to go out on a mission and capture a criminal. Just as the criminal was escorted to the interrogation room, he suddenly received a call from Meng Qingxue. "Chu-ho, are you free tonight? We haven't seen each other for a long time. How have you been?" Hearing Meng Qingxue's voice, Chu-ho couldn't help but smile. "Okay, I'm at work now. I'll probably be free after 6 o'clock. "Well, then, where do you work? I'll pick you up." "You came to pick me up?" Chu-ho smiled, but he did not refuse and told him the address. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Meng Qingxue stood at the entrance of the police station in a daze. She looked at Chu-ho, who had changed into casual clothes and was walking out. She could not react for a moment and her gaze was fixed on him. She had actually joined the anti-gang team. If she remembered correctly, wasn't Xiao Bao's biological father Gu Jinglian from the Gu family? His father was in charge of the gang and his mother was in charge of the anti-gang team. Wasn't this too extreme? Chu-ho was overjoyed to see her. He walked forward and hugged her gently. The two of them had not met for a long time and missed each other dearly. After she had settled down in the Gu family, she had no choice but to go out at first. Meng Qingxue had contacted her through Uncle Fu, but Chu Ho did not have permission to go out, so they could not meet. Chapter 3496. As he had to take care of the children and the Mu group's crisis during that period of time, it was difficult for him to find the time to go out with her. He was also worried about her going out alone. Seeing that Meng Qingxue had driven here, Chu Ho was a little surprised. "You've gotten your driver's license." "Long ago." Meng Qingxue said, "It's been a long time since we last met. I've been thinking about you. Since I'm free today, let me treat you to Western food. It doesn't matter what we eat. I'm not picky." The two of them arrived at the Western restaurant. Meng Qingxue had booked a private room early in the morning and only then did they take their seats. Meng Qingxue suddenly took out a stack of envelopes from her bag and handed them to her. Have you forgotten?" Meng Qingxue laughed. "During our time in Yen City, I've been staying at your place and eating your food. It's a total of more than 20,000 yuan, not a cent more or less." Chu Ho could not help but feel a little touched. It was rare that she still remembered this. Chu Ho opened the envelope. There was a total of 25,000 yuan in it. She did not refuse and accepted it. Meng Qingxue started chatting about the recent situation. Ever since Song Enya's incident, the Muse and the Songs had cut ties. Since then, because of the company's affairs, Mu Linfeng fell seriously ill and was bedridden. Since then, Mu Yanqing had officially taken over the Mu group. Although Mu Yanqing was not as good as Mu Yaja in this aspect, he was still from the Muse. Although he was not as outstanding as Mu Yaja, he still managed the company well. Mu Yanqing was not confident, but Meng Qingxue had been quietly by his side, encouraging him. In order to fight for his dignity, Mu Yanqing was determined to make a name for himself. Although the Mu group was not as good as before, it still faced many crises during this period of time. Its capital chain was broken, and shareholders kept withdrawing their shares. At one point, it was in danger. Now, the Mu group was at least standing firm. Although it was not as good as before, and there were still many people who were pessimistic about it, Mu Yanqing devoted himself to his career and maintained the Mu group's original state. This was already very difficult. After 10 months of pregnancy, Meng Qingxue gave birth to an adorable son for Mu Yanqing. Her son looked more like her. He had delicate features and fair skin. He was very cute. Mu Yanqing named him Mu Wenqi. Meng Qingxue showed Chu Ho a full moon photo. After becoming a mother, Meng Qingxue's greatest joy every day was being with her baby. She wasn't the kind of person who especially liked to show off her baby in her circle of friends. She just felt that it was cute and took pictures of it herself. She even saved it on her phone. At this moment, the little guy was still young, but he had already learned how to walk. Unexpectedly, after the two of them parted, in the blink of an eye, the little guy who had been obediently staying in her stomach had already learned how to walk. Chu Ho could not help but feel deeply moved. Meng Qingxue added, "I've always been thinking about Xiao Bao." However, she had just given birth and her body was weak. Now that she has recovered a little, the child cannot be separated from her. Otherwise, there will be plenty of opportunities in the future. Chu Ho paused for a moment and suddenly asked with concern, "How about now? Are you okay?" "Yes." "How does Mu Yanqing treat you?" Chu Ho's face suddenly darkened. "Is he still like before?" Chapter 3497. He still remembered that after Mu Yanqing and Song Enya's wedding banquet was messed up by Gu Jinglian, Mu Yanqing was unexpectedly much more relaxed. When he mentioned Meng Qingxue's marriage to Mu Linfeng again, Mu Linfeng surprisingly did not reject it. Perhaps, other than Mu Yanqing, he could not count on anyone else in the Mu family. Mu Linfeng was hoping that the Mu Group's century-old foundation would not be destroyed in his hands overnight. Hence, when Mu Yanqing proposed to marry Meng Qingxue, Old Master Mu did not object. Mu Yanqing and Meng Qingxue collected their marriage certificate and held a special wedding banquet. They did not invite any guests. In the church, other than some important elders of the Mu family and some devout believers, there was no one else. They took their vows in front of the priest. When it was time to exchange rings, Meng Qingxue carefully put the ring on his ring finger. The two of them looked at each other and their eyes reddened. Mu Yanqing knew very well how hard it was to come by such happiness. Along the way, if the two of them had given up easily, perhaps they would not be where they were today. Meng Qingxue was also filled with emotions. She had been waiting for him for so many years. Finally, she got what she wanted and married the person she loved. When Mu Yanqing put the ring on her finger, tears welled up in her eyes. She cried and laughed at the same time. She was so happy that she looked a little embarrassed. She said to him, "Whether you're Mu Yanqing of the Mu Group or the Mu Yanqing who has left the Mu Group, you'll always be my husband, Mu Yanqing." Mu Yanqing's eyes reddened when he heard this. The two of them hugged each other tightly. After they got married in the church, they flew to various countries to travel and get married. Although there was no grand wedding, Meng Qingxue had nothing else to ask for as long as she could be with him. Although he was busy with the Mu Group's business, he was never stingy with spending time with her during the pregnancy. On the day of labor, he received the news and rushed to the hospital from the company. He put on a sterile gown and entered the delivery room. Just as he entered the delivery room, the child was born. It was a son. To Mu Yanqing, whether it was a son or a daughter, he would like them both. This was their first child. In the future, they might have a second one. However, this child came with twists and turns, and almost died prematurely. Mu Yanqing's heart was filled with countless emotions as he held the child in his arms. After giving birth to the child, Mu Yanqing bought a villa and registered it under Meng Qingxue's name as compensation for the hardships she went through during her pregnancy. This was also his promise to her. Meng Qingxue did not care about these things, but Mu Yanqing said, "This house will be our home in the future. No matter what, this will always be your harbor." After having a child, Mu Yanqing's careerism was stimulated. No matter what, Mu Yanqing would still spare a day every weekend to accompany him. After the breastfeeding period, Meng Qingxue wanted to find a job, but Mu Yanqing did not allow it. Firstly, although the child had passed the breastfeeding period, he still needed someone to take care of him. Although she had hired a nanny, she was not as close as a mother. Secondly, even if Meng Qingxue worked, the few thousand yuan she earned a month could not compare to the money he earned in the blink of an eye. He would work hard to manage his career and give her something to rely on. However, with the arrival of the child, his concept of family was awakened. Therefore, to him, family became more important than his career. Chapter 3498. He said, "When I was young, my parents were busy with their careers and didn't have time to accompany me. I don't want my son to have the same childhood as me. You don't have to think about work. Raising you and our son is my career. Your career is to take care of the family." Meng Qingxue was touched. Mu Yanqing was not good at expressing himself, but she understood what he wanted to express. He pitied her and did not want her to work hard. He was already very busy with work, so he hoped that she could take his place and spend more time with their son. Although the two of them would occasionally bicker, even their daily bickering was filled with happiness. Perhaps, life was like this, and happiness was so simple. A family of three, 2 people in one house, 3 meals, 4 seasons. It was plain, but warm. "What about you?" Meng Qingxue probed, "Have you accepted Gu Jing?" "Mr. Gu." She was afraid of Gu Jinglian from the bottom of her heart and had never dared to call him by his name. Chu Ho's face stiffened slightly. At the mention of Gu Jinglian, she thought of what happened last night and said unhappily, "Why are you mentioning him?" With that, she sucked on her straw with a cold face. Sizzle, the atmosphere was very cold. Meng Qingshue's lips twitched and she smiled awkwardly. "I saw that you were staying with the Gu family and thought, that's because Xiao Bao wants a father." Chu Ho said coldly, "It has nothing to do with me." With that, she rested her chin on her hand and sucked on her straw again. Sizzle, Meng Qingxue held her coffee cup and did not know whether to laugh or cry. "Did the two of you quarrel?" "No." Then, Meng Qingxue suddenly said meaningfully, "I heard that the two of you are already married." Chu Ho was a little surprised. "How did you know?" Meng Qingxue opened WeChat and clicked on her conversation with Xiao Bao. Chu Ho took a look and was stunned. "Auntie Qingxue, Mommy and Daddy have already registered their marriage." Xiao Bao is so happy. It showed that it was sent at 7:00 last night. Chu Ho was petrified. This guy, he actually leaked the news. Meng Qingxue laughed and said, "Since you're already married, why are you still insisting that it has nothing to do with you? I heard from Yanqing that Gu Jinglian is quite a formidable person. He's swift and decisive. When I told him about your marriage, he was shocked." "Why?" "That's because I don't believe that a man like him would marry a woman." After a pause, Meng Qingxue continued, "He doesn't believe in marriage. He said that he won't get married." Chu Ho was a little surprised. "Is that so?" Meng Qingxue asked curiously, "So, how did you get married?" "He suggested it." Meng Qingxue was stunned. "Ha! To be precise." Chu Ho sneered. "He begged me." Meng Qingxue, she could not help but imagine Gu Jinglian kneeling on the ground, hugging Chu Ho's thigh pitifully and begging for marriage. Pfft. She was amused by her own imagination. Chu Ho said unhappily, "What are you laughing at? I didn't expect the rumored Master Gu to beg a woman to marry him. If you hadn't said it yourself, I wouldn't have believed it." Chapter 3499. Xiao Bao didn't have a father since he was young, so he was ostracized by many children of his age. It's only natural that he felt insecure. Meng Qingxue paused for a moment and said, "But for a child, a marriage certificate is not the only thing that can give him a sense of security. A harmonious family is the most important thing." Chu Ho said calmly, "It's a pity that I don't have any feelings for Gu Jinglian, and he doesn't feel the same for me either." "So, you and CEO Gu are planning to keep up the act?" Meng Qingxue couldn't help but laugh. "When the child grows up, this matter won't be able to be hidden anymore." Chu Ho asked, "What else can I do? Do you want me to make the act real?" "Chu Ho, there's something I've always wanted to ask you." Meng Qingxue suddenly asked, "How did you get Xiao Bao in the first place?" "This kind of thing is consensual. If he really forced you, with your character and skills, you might not be able to force him. Don't tell me you really don't have any feelings for CEO Gu." Chu Ho furrowed his eyebrows, and a complicated expression appeared on his face. She sucked on the straw absent-mindedly. Her teeth squeezed the straw until it was deformed. Her mind was in a mess. For her, the memories before she lost her memory were not that deep. She was also very curious as to why something like that happened between her and Gu Jinglian. Was it because she couldn't help it, or because she was forced? If she was really forced, with her strong character, Gu Jinglian might not have succeeded. But if she was willing, how could she be moved by a man as fickle as Gu Jinglian? Although she had regained her memories before she lost her memory, to her, it was like she had gained some ordinary memories. Therefore, she couldn't tell what kind of feeling she had for Gu Jinglian at that time. "Chu Ho, I think you might have had feelings for President Gu back then. Maybe you couldn't help it. What about Xiao Bao?" Chu Ho didn't say anything else. He seemed to be avoiding the topic on purpose. He smiled at Meng Qingxue and said, "Let's eat. I'm starving." With that, she began to cut the steak. Meng Qingxue saw that she deliberately avoided the topic and knew that she must be confused now, so she did not mention it again. When Chu Ho got home, he bumped into Uncle Fu in the living room. Uncle Fu immediately came up to her and said excitedly, "In a few days, it will be Xiao Bao's birthday. Chu Ho, do you have any ideas?" Xiao Bao had said that he would invite all the children in the class to celebrate his birthday at the Gu residence. Old Master was afraid of noise, so he didn't allow it. At this moment, the father and son were in a deadlock. "Do you want to persuade them?" Chu Ho turned to look at Uncle Fu with a complicated expression. Suddenly, he said tentatively, "Uncle Fu, yes." She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, but hesitated. In fact, she wanted to ask him how she felt about Gu Jinglian in the past. Did she like him? Or did she hate him? If she hated him, then why did she and Gu Jinglian have that kind of thing happened? But if she really did like him, why did she forget about those feelings in her life? Chu Ho felt extremely confused about the current situation. She didn't know how to face Gu Jinglian. As for Xiao Bao's vision of a harmonious family of three, she didn't know what to do. It wasn't that she didn't want to. It was just that she was really indifferent when it came to matters of the heart. Chapter 3500. She had also become dismissive of matters of the heart. She felt that feelings were dispensable. Even if she was alone, she could still lead a good life. However, ever since she had Xiao Bao, she had another concern in her heart. At the same time, she also valued her responsibilities as a mother. However, no matter what Xiao Bao wanted, she was willing to give it her all. Yet, it was difficult for her to fulfill his dreams. Getting the marriage certificate with Gu Jinglian was just an act. Could it be that she had to make the act real for Xiao Bao and force herself to do so? Uncle Fu saw that she wanted to say something but was hesitating. He couldn't help but laugh and say, "You seem to have something to ask me." When Chu Ho heard this, she plucked up her courage and turned around to ask Uncle Fu, "What do you think my attitude towards Gu Jinglian was when I was in the Gu family?" Uncle Fu was stunned for a moment. Then he sighed slowly and said, "I can't make any judgments about what happened between you and Old Master. However, Chu Ho, you used to go by Old Master's side under the alias of Hong He. At that time, Old Master already knew your identity and you were his personal companion. You had countless opportunities to make a move on Old Master." After a pause, under Chu Ho's stunned gaze, Uncle Fu asked meaningfully, "Unfortunately, you didn't succeed from the beginning to the end and Old Master never exposed your identity. Don't you think that this is strange? As the saying goes, the onlooker sees the game more clearly. But as an onlooker, I can't say anything. It's just that when it comes to matters of the heart, it's better to let nature take its course." Just as Chu Ho was deep in thought, Uncle Fu suddenly said, "All these are not important. What's important is that Xiao Bao and Old Master are quarreling over the birthday venue. You should go and persuade them quickly and come up with some ideas at the same time." Chu Ho's face was full of black lines. When she walked into the study, she saw Xiao Bao sitting on the sofa angrily with his arms crossed, looking very angry. Gu Jinglian, on the other hand, was sitting calmly in front of his desk, holding a weasel brush and writing ink. Seeing that Chu Ho had come, Xiao Bao's angry face fell. He opened his arms and pounced on her. "Mom!" Sob, sob, sob. Gu Jinglian looked up and saw that she had returned. He ignored her as if she was invisible. Chu Ho picked up Xiao Bao, and the little guy poured out his grievances to her. "Isn't it my birthday this Sunday? I told Dad that I wanted to hold a birthday party at the Gu residence. We could save money and have fun. But Father didn't allow it. What should we do?" Chu Ho's lips twitched. "Save money. Yes, Dad said that he wanted to book the entire hotel, but I think it's too wasteful. Xiao Bao whispered in her ear, I heard from Uncle Fu that it costs tens of thousands to book the entire hotel. It's so expensive. I was trying to save money for Dad, but he called me an idiot. He even said that the Gu residence is so big. If my little friends get lost, it'll be too troublesome to find them one by one. Chu Ho was speechless. That was true. The Gu residence was located in a place with good feng shui. Every inch of land was worth gold, but even so, the Gu residence was still very big. When she first entered the Gu residence, she got lost and couldn't find her way. She imagined that it would be troublesome if a large group of children were to run around the Gu residence and something happened to them. Furthermore, those powerful subordinates of the Gu residence all had ferocious looks on their faces. Would they really not scare those innocent and naive children? Chapter 35:01. Why don't you listen to Daddy and book the entire hotel? Chu Ho said. Gu Jinglian's brush suddenly paused. When the word father came out of her mouth, it gave him a strange feeling in his heart. For some reason, he felt warm. He had never felt such a feeling before. Chu Ho continued, Daddy is rich. Don't think about saving money for Daddy. Gu Jinglian was speechless. He looked up and his face immediately turned pale. Chu Ho glanced at him and said meaningfully, Daddy is so rich. If it's your birthday, you can spend it however extravagantly you want. Xiao Bao refused to comply. I want to spend it in my own home. As he said this, he turned around and looked at Gu Jinglian with a look of hesitation. Chu Ho had no choice but to say to Gu Jinglian, why don't we let him spend it in the Gu residence? Gu Jinglian said coldly, it's troublesome. He found it noisy. Xiao Bao alone was noisy enough. If there was a group of little kids, it would be so noisy that the entire house would be torn apart. Just thinking about that scene gave him a headache. Chu Ho put down Xiao Bao, walked in front of him and threw his brush aside. Gu Jinglian frowned, but heard her say, Gu Jinglian, this is Xiao Bao's first birthday in the Gu residence. Since he wants to spend it in the Gu residence, why don't you agree to it this time? He narrowed his eyes, but Chu Ho lost her patience and grabbed his collar. She smiled, but her tone was unfriendly. Say, okay. Gu Jinglian looked unhappy and his lips curled into a dangerous smile. Are you ordering me? How is this an order? I'm clearly discussing it with you. Chu Ho smiled and gritted her teeth. Hurry up and agree. Xiao Bao also rushed in front of him and leaned on the table. His watery eyes stared at him with a look of anticipation. Gu Jinglian, the mother and son were singing the same tune and had great chemistry. Gu Jinglian curled his lips impatiently and said, sure, but you'll be in charge. Chu Ho immediately agreed, okay. When Xiao Bao heard this, he immediately hugged Chu Ho excitedly and cheered, yay yay yay. Mom is the best. Mommy is the best. Gu Jinglian was a little angry. He was clearly the one who took a step back, yet this guy was hugging Chu Ho and cheering. What was the meaning of this? Xiao Bao sensed Gu Jinglian's dissatisfaction and knew how to read people's expressions. She immediately walked in front of him and threw herself into his arms. She hugged him and smiled contentedly. Thank you, Dad. Mwah. Gu Jinglian pushed him away in disgust. Get lost. Just like that, this matter was settled. Xiao Bao's birthday happened to fall on the weekend, so all the children were able to attend. Chu Ho and Uncle Fu had already prepared in advance. However, the most troublesome problem for the birthday banquet at the Gu residence was, Chu Ho stood in front of all the men. Dozens of subordinates stood in a row and looked straight ahead. At the Gu residence, besides Gu Jinglian and Uncle Fu, there were the elders of the 4 main halls and their hired thugs. When the time came, if the children rushed in, then these people might not. It would be too scary. Chu-ho suddenly thought of an idea and told Uncle Fu about it. When Uncle Fu heard this, he was dumbfounded. Is this really okay? What else can we do? What if they scare the children with their fierce faces? Let them smile. Chu-ho said, they all have the face of a villain. Even if they smile, it's still very scary. Chapter 3502. A group of men complained, Sister Chu, what do you mean by villainous face? We protest. That's right. You're attacking us personally. Chu-ho suddenly turned her head and glanced at them coldly. Everyone was so frightened that they kept quiet. Uncle Fu said helplessly, all right. We'll do as you say. When the men heard this, they immediately wailed and howled, no. We don't want to wear those clothes. A real man knows when to yield and when to stand tall. We might as well die if we wear those clothes. That's right. Sister Chu, it's so shameful to wear those clothes. We won't wear them even if we die. Chu-ho said slowly, all right. I'll satisfy you. A few minutes later, more than 10 men were lying on the ground in a mess. A few of them attacked together, wave after wave, but they were still defeated by Chu-ho alone. This woman, she's so scary. Chu-ho clapped her hands casually and said coldly, you can't even beat me, and you still have the nerve to call yourself a real man. It's settled then. Uncle Fu, buy the clothes and let them change into them. Uncle Fu looked at the corpses on the ground and his lips twitched violently. I got it. In the blink of an eye, it was Xiao Bao's birthday. Early in the morning, Xiao Bao climbed out of bed. In the past, he was famous for lazing in bed, but today was different. Today was his birthday. It was his first birthday in the Gu family. He was so excited that he couldn't sleep for the entire night. He woke up early in the morning. The little guy washed his face and brushed his teeth before running downstairs. When he reached the door, he was shocked by the strange scene in the courtyard and froze on the spot. At night, Uncle Fu spent the night decorating. In the courtyard, there were colorful hydrogen balloons tied to the trees. In the originally antique courtyard, there were colorful ribbons tied to the beams. A person wearing a Doraemon costume floated in front of him and said with a resentful voice, "Good morning, young master." On the other side, one of the men in charge of smashing was wearing Minnie's costume. He was holding a broom and cleaning the yard laboriously. Its ears were erect, it had a big head and a skinny body. It was very cute. However, it was hard to imagine that the person wrapped in the costume was a ferocious man. In the courtyard, the group of thugs had already changed their clothes in advance. Although they were unwilling, Uncle Fu threw the costume to them, and they obediently put it on. Chu-ho was worried that their fierce faces would scare the children, so he asked Uncle Fu to buy all kinds of doll costumes and instructed them to put them on. Thus, wherever he looked, he saw all kinds of men in cartoon costumes walking around. There were Mickey, Goofy, Donald Duck, and even Nick the Fox and Judy the Rabbit from Zootopia, which were his favorite animated movies. For a moment, he felt like he was in a fairy tale world. Xiao Bao's eyes lit up. He found it unbelievable. So cute. A complaint came from not far away. It's so stuffy. One of them had just taken off his headgear when Uncle Fu walked over and kicked him. Wear it. You're not allowed to take it off. That person had no choice but to wear the headgear obediently. So cute. So cute, so cute. Xiao Bao rushed over excitedly and hugged Judy the Rabbit from behind. Judy the Rabbit. It's a real Judy the Rabbit. And Bao. Kung Fu Panda. Chapter 3503. Xiao Bao yelled excitedly. The courtyard was filled with his favorite cartoon characters. He was like a little mouse that had fallen into a rice bowl. He was extremely happy. Early in the morning, Gu Jinglian was awakened by Xiao Bao's yelling downstairs. He opened his eyes and was still sleepy when he vaguely heard Xiao Bao's voice coming from outside the window. "Wow! Bunny Judy, can you give me your autograph? I'm your little fan. I've watched your role in Zootopia many times. You're my idol. You're my idol." The corners of Gu Jinglian's eyebrows twitched violently. He was a little confused. He rolled out of bed, walked to the window, and opened the curtains. Through the window, he suddenly saw the courtyard full of cartoon characters walking around. His face darkened instantly. He saw that the burly and valiant subordinates of the Gu residents had been forced to change into all kinds of cartoon costumes and were walking around the courtyard. There were colorful hydrogen balloons on the trees, as well as colorful ribbons. Where was this? The Gu residence, which was usually cold and antique, had suddenly become half a fairy tale paradise. Gu Jinglian was speechless. He walked to the study and saw Chu Ho lying on the sofa. She was sleeping soundly with her arms behind her head. He kicked her awake. Chu Ho woke up with a start. She bounced up from the sofa and looked up to see Gu Jinglian's gloomy face. He was glaring at her with a pair of cold eyes, as if he was silently questioning her. "What did you do?" Chu Ho was instantly confused. "It's so early in the morning. Why are you so angry?" Just as she finished speaking, Xiao Bao's voice came from outside the window again. "Goodbye. Can I hug you?" Chu Ho rushed to the window and saw that Big White, who had been holding a broom and cleaning the yard with great effort, was suddenly pushed to the ground by Xiao Bao's bear. Big White was sprawled on the ground, its two arms and legs struggling, but it couldn't turn over no matter how hard it tried. Xiao Bao helped him up with much difficulty. He bent down to pick up the broom, but with his big belly, he couldn't even squat down. At a glance, he looked extremely adorable. It was hard to imagine that a fiendish man was wrapped inside Big White. Chu Ho turned around awkwardly and saw Gu Jinglian crossing his arms expressionlessly. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Were you the one who decorated the Gu residence like this? Isn't it good?" Chu Ho smiled and said, "Look at how happy your son is. Gu Jinglian, it's a rare day." She added, "It'll be fine after the birthday party." Gu Jinglian snorted, "Childish. Childish. Isn't it good to be a little childish? Don't all children like childish things?" Chu Ho paused and said meaningfully, "I also heard that someone liked the 7 Calabash brothers when they were young." Gu Jinglian's face darkened and he flew into a rage out of humiliation. "Who told you that?" "Humph, see, you admit it too. You even hugged Winnie the Pooh to sleep when you were young." One night, Uncle Fu was drunk and pulled her aside to tell her about Gu Jinglian's childhood. It was said that the 4-year-old Gu Jinglian was especially obsessed with cartoons. Chapter 3504. His grandson was the future successor of the Gu family. Becoming a police officer. How useless would that be? Uncle Fu also said that he still remembered that in one of the episodes of Black Cat Detective, there was a murder case in Zootopia. A male praying mantis died, and in the end, Black Cat Detective solved the case. It turned out that the two praying mantises got married, and the male praying mantis let the female praying mantis eat him so that she could give birth to his child. It turned out that the female praying mantis needed nutrition to give birth to baby mantises, so she ate the male praying mantis to maintain her nutrition. At night, Gu Jinglian was so scared that he hid under his blanket and swore that he would never get married. Uncle Fu explained to him several times that praying mantises were praying mantises, and humans were humans. His future wife would not eat him. Gu Jinglian finally believed him. This was not the stupidest thing. The stupidest thing was when he passed by a shop on the streets. At that time, Gu Jinglian, who was only 4 years old, saw that the shop sold bubble machines. They looked like pistols, and when the trigger was pulled, many bubbles would be blown out. At that time, it was very novel and sold very expensive, but many children liked it. He took a fancy to it and said that he wanted it. Uncle Fu did not agree, so Gu Jinglian crossed his arms and sat on the ground with his legs crossed. His face was sullen and he did not say a word. This child was stubborn, but he did not cry or make a fuss. However, he did not say much either. He had an expression that said, "If you don't buy it for me, I won't leave." Uncle Fu was not willing to indulge him, so he pretended to leave. However, after walking far away from the shop, this guy still did not follow him. He turned back curiously, but saw that the guy was still lying on the ground and refused to get up. The shop owner could not stand it anymore. She took a bunch of bubble machines and handed them to him, saying, "Here, stop fooling around. I'll give them to you to play with, okay?" She also thought that Gu Jinglian was too cute. He was pink and had a cute face. When he got angry, his cheeks puffed up like a bun. However, Gu Jinglian did not want it. He wanted to buy it, so he did not want to take it for free. Fu Bo had no choice but to buy it, seeing that he couldn't persuade him. In the end, on the way home, Gu Jinglian held the bubble gun and could not put it down. He played with it all the way home, and when he got home, he could not spit out any bubbles. He was smart and knew how the bubbles worked, so he went to mix some detergent and played with it happily. When Chu Ho heard this, she convulsed with laughter. She did not expect Gu Jinglian to be so adorable when he was young. Only then did she realize who Xiao Bao had inherited his silly cuteness from. At first, no matter how she looked at Xiao Bao, she was suspicious. Whose genes did this guy inherit? She was known for her cold personality, yet this fellow was so cheerful. Most importantly, he was also very stupid. Sometimes, he would be moved to tears just by watching cartoons. Now she knew that Xiao Bao was indeed Gu Jinglian's biological son. Chu Ho walked up to him and squinted at him. "Tell me, why were you so cute when you were young?" At the same time, she felt that it was unbelievable. If Uncle Fu had not mentioned it unintentionally, she would not have imagined that Gu Jinglian was so adorable when he was young. In her impression, Gu Jinglian must have been a bully when he was young. He must have been domineering and unreasonable. Otherwise, he would have been like a little old man with a sullen face and would not play with the other children. She did not expect him to be as childish as the other children. "Shut up." Gu Jinglian's face strangely flushed red. He turned around and snorted coldly. This was obviously awkward. He gritted his teeth secretly. This Uncle Fu was using his past to talk about things again. His mouth was not reliable at all. Chapter 3505. Chu Ho walked in front of him again. "Don't be shy. Who doesn't have a childhood? Look, didn't you like those things when you were young? It's Xiao Bao's birthday today, so just let him be." Gu Jinglian said expressionlessly, "Do as you wish." After saying that, he left with an ashen face. In the morning, many parents sent their children over. At first, many parents were worried. After all, Xiao Bao's parents were not to be trifled with. If their children were to be naughty in front of them and offend them, they might follow in Li Xianlai's footsteps. However, they were on tenterhooks the entire journey. When the car stopped at the entrance of the Gu residence and they got out of the car, they saw a figure in a costume standing at the entrance to welcome the guests. When the children saw it, their eyes lit up. "Oh my God! It's Big White! Big White from Superpower Marine Corps!" The children all surrounded him, as if they wanted to pounce on him. The parents were also stunned. Who would have thought that the birthday party at the Gu residence would be so different from what they had imagined? This time, they were relieved. However, this birthday party was too different. The birthday party that they had imagined was probably what they had imagined, with the entire hotel booked. When they first heard that it was being held at the Goo residence, they were still wondering how big the Goo residence was and if it could accommodate a class of children. When they reached the entrance, all the parents who came to send their children were stunned. Wasn't this 2F** king big? It was just like the mansions of the wealthy in ancient times. Just walking through the entrance and seeing the winding corridors, as well as the huge garden and courtyard, they were scared out of their wits. They sucked in a deep breath and only let it out when they left the Goo residence. It was 2F** king big. Many parents got lost in the winding corridors. He was indeed rich and overbearing. This piece of land was one of the most expensive in the entire capital. It could be said that every inch of land was worth an inch of gold. Rumor had it that if this land was taken over by the government, it would definitely cost at least 300,000 yuan per square foot. According to their estimation, the entire Goo residence could no longer be measured in square feet. It was more appropriate to use the unit mu to measure it. Comparing oneself to others is really infuriating. Many parents sighed with emotion. They had been working hard since they were very young. After working hard, they finally managed to buy a condominium that was 100 square meters. In the capital, this was considered a standard for the wealthy. Many of them relied on their ancestors' real estate. The main government had demolished 2 houses. Otherwise, with the current housing prices, which were easily tens of thousands of yuan per square meter, and the central area was hundreds of thousands of yuan. How could they afford it? Who would have thought that other people's houses were measured in acres? If the Goo residence was demolished, several buildings could be built. What was even more frightening was that the ownership of the land was in the hands of the Goo family. The government didn't dare to touch it at all. In other words, even if the Goo family were to fall into ruin one day, they could still rely on the mansion to support several generations of people. There was no doubt about this. Many parents had come in worried, but when they saw their children being brought in by people in cartoon costumes, they left with peace of mind. Xiao Bao had been waiting at the door until a Mercedes-Benz slowly drove over and stopped. A young woman opened the car door and carried Shang'er out. Shang'er. When Xiao Bao saw Shang'er, he happily ran to her and held her hand. He said shyly, "Why are you only here now? I've been waiting for you for a long time." Chapter 35:06. I'm sorry, birthday boy. There was a traffic jam on the way, so I'm late. It's okay. Xiao Bao said a little embarrassedly. Shang'er immediately took out an exquisitely wrapped present from behind her back and shyly handed it to him, saying, "Xiao Bao, happy birthday." "Oh, thank you, here. This is a present for you. I don't know if you'll like it." Shang'er's voice became softer and softer, obviously very shy. However, Xiao Bao seemed very excited and said expectantly, "Can I open it?" "Now." Shang'er said, "You can open it if you want, but if you don't like it, don't be angry, why would I? As long as it's a present from Shang'er, I'll like it." "Okay." Xiao Bao opened the present curiously and saw a bouquet of flowers lying quietly in the gift box. However, this bouquet of flowers was different from ordinary bouquets. This bouquet of flowers was tied up with many starry sky lollipops. Shang'er didn't know what present to give, but thinking that Xiao Bao liked to eat sweets, she tied all her favorite starry sky lollipops into a bouquet and made it into a bouquet of flowers. Wow! The beautiful starry sky lollipops instantly lit up his eyes. He suddenly leaned close to Shang'er and kissed her on the cheek, saying happily, "Thank you, Shang'er. I like it a lot." Shang'er's face suddenly became as hot as a burning cloud. So much so that she stuttered, You like it, as long as you like it. These sweets. I can't bear to let my dad eat them." But because you're my best friend, so... Shang'er's mother squatted down and said to Xiao Bao, I'll leave Shang'er in your care today. Okay. Shang'er, have fun today. Mommy will come to pick you up later. Okay. The two little guys watched as the car left. Xiao Bao immediately held her hand and said with a smile, Shang'er, come in quickly. Shang'er was led through the door by Xiao Bao. As soon as she stepped through the door, she was shocked to see the yard full of cartoon characters. She was so shocked that her eyes widened. Wow! Other than gasping in amazement, Shang'er was so excited that she couldn't say a single word. Shang'er also liked to watch cartoons. She had watched many Disney animated movies many times. Her favorite movies were Frozen, and she also liked Dubai from Superland Marines. As such, tears welled up in her eyes as soon as she saw Dubai. In the hearts of young children, the characters in these animated films were not just limited to the adult world. The word cute was enough to describe them. To them, these people were the hottest superstars, and even more so, their dreams. Most of the children in the class had arrived and were playing with the cartoon dolls in the yard. It was as if he was in a fairy tale world. Shang'er even suspected that she was dreaming. Xiao Bao asked, Jean, you also like Dubai, right? Yes. I like Big White the most. Xiao Bao immediately said, Dubai. Come here. Hearing his little master's summon, Dubai immediately rushed over and waved his hand as he stood in front of them with his big belly. Xiao Bao introduced, this is Princess Shang'er. Shang'er stared at Dubai nervously. Chapter 3507. Shang'er blushed shyly. Hello, Dubai. Pausing for a moment, she suddenly smiled brightly and placed her hands behind her back shyly. Dubai, can I hug you? She asked nervously. Dubai tilted his head, looking very adorable on the surface. However, the scar-faced man in the costume had a gloomy expression on his face. He was the worst at dealing with children. Even so, Xiao Bao glared at him fiercely from the side, as if he would not hold back if he dared to refuse. Dubai immediately opened his arms and said gently, of course. Shang'er blushed even harder, but she happily pounced toward Dubai. Upstairs, Gu Jinglian looked at the yard full of dolls and little ghosts with a gloomy expression. Originally, having such a stupid and idiotic son like Xiao Bao was already enough to give him a headache. Now, he had to deal with a bunch of brats. Especially in Xiao Bao's class, there were a few mischievous children who were fooling around in the yard. They climbed up the rockery nimbly, and below them was the pond. Uncle Fu stood at the foot of the rockery anxiously and tried to coax them to come down. They won't come down. They won't come down. Wow! There are so many fish in the pond. The fish are so cute. I really want to touch them. A group of children lay by the pond and looked around. Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows gloomily. The children's chattering filled his ears, and it was as if thousands of mosquitoes were flying around his ears. That was why he hated little brats the most. They were especially annoying. Speaking of Gu Jinglian, he was not a fan of brats. At first, he did not have much patience with Xiao Bao. However, after spending some time together and getting used to this guy, he sometimes found him very cute. Although he was really annoyed when he was annoyed. However, he was still his son. However, he might not have half the patience to deal with other children. Gu Jinglian closed the window and returned to his study. After a while, Uncle Fu came upstairs and knocked on the door. Master, the cake is about to be cut. I don't have to show up. Gu Jinglian said impatiently. He felt extremely troubled at the thought of going downstairs to cut the cake and having to face dozens of little idiots. That's not very good, is it? After all, you are Xiao Bao's father. If you are not present on Xiao Bao's birthday, it will inevitably make the little guy unhappy. Gu Jinglian, he rubbed his brows tiredly and stood up abruptly. 10 minutes later, Gu Jinglian appeared downstairs and happened to bump into Chu He pushing the three-tiered cake pagoda into the dining room. The cafeteria was very big. There were 10 tables in the cafeteria. 4 children sat at one table while Little Treasure and Shang'er sat at another table. The table was filled with sumptuous dishes, fruits, desserts, and all kinds of delicacies. However, the children did not care about it at all. They were looking forward to the cake, so the delicacies in front of them did not attract their attention at all. Everyone looked around, looking forward to it. It was not until Chu Ho slowly pushed the cake tower into the dining room that the delicate-looking cake fell into the children's line of sight, causing a huge commotion. No one had ever seen such a beautiful and exquisite cake. Chapter 3508. This was specially made by Uncle Fu. He realized that Xiao Bao especially liked to buy. Hence, he sent his subordinates to ask around and found the best cake shop in Beijing. He reserved this cake half a month in advance. The cake tower had 3 levels, and each level was filled with chocolate. On the top level, the pie was made with icing and looked extremely adorable. It was a 100% replica of the cartoon image in the movie. Wow! What a beautiful cake! Many of the children widened their eyes in envy. When Chu Ho pushed the cake to the center, many of the children were already drooling. Gu Jinglian had just stepped into the restaurant when he heard a sea of cheers. Dubai! What a beautiful cake! Ah, I want that Dubai! Gu Jinglian's head was about to explode from the noise. Chu Ho immediately said, Xiao Bao, why aren't you coming up? It's almost time to share the cake. Xiao Bao had just walked over and started looking for a knife and fork. Uncle Fu immediately stopped him and said, Xiao Bao, you haven't sung the birthday song yet. Oh, right. The birthday song. Shang'er stood up and turned around. Let's sing the birthday song for Xiao Bao. Okay. The children who were eager to eat the cake were surprisingly cooperative. They clapped their little hands and the sound of clapping could be heard. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to Xiao Bao. Happy birthday to you. Clap, clap, clap. The sound of hands clapping. 30 or so immature voices of children sounded out. They were tone deaf, and they were like demonic voices that could destroy everything in their path. Gu Jinglian was almost possessed by the voices, but Xiao Bao was overjoyed. Chu Ho placed the crown on his head and urged, Xiao Bao, make a wish. Okay. Xiao Bao immediately clasped his hands together, closed his eyes, and began to make a wish. Immediately after, he made his wish and blew out the candles. Happy birthday to Xiao Bao. Let's eat cake. Let's eat cake. The children swarmed forward like a tide. Uncle Fu immediately rushed over to maintain order. Don't fight. Let our little birthday girl cut the cake. Xiao Bao looked up at Gu Jinglian and said nervously, Dad, the cake is so tall. How do we cut it? The cake was more than a meter tall, but he was not even as tall as the cake. Even if he stood on his tiptoes, he could not cut it. Gu Jinglian looked at him with disdain, but immediately bent down and hugged him in his arms. Chu Ho held his little hand, and together, the mother and son cut the cake. When it was time to divide the cake, the group of little fellows started to squabble. I want big white. Dubai is mine. 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 Shang-er tugged at Xiao Bao's sleeve and said pitifully, Xiao Bao, I really like big white. Can you give big white to me? Of course. Xiao Bao said to everyone, can you give big white to Shang-er? A boy stood up and said indignantly, why should Shang-er be the only one? Xiao Bao, you're biased. I want it too. Shang pouted. Seeing this, Xiao Bao put on a protective stance. Give it to Shang. Give it to me. Big White is Shang-er's. Big White is mine. Gu Jinglian could not take it anymore and directly cut Big White in half. Clean and straightforward. Half each. Xiao Bao, Shang-er. Chapter 3509. The scene suddenly quieted down, not a single sound could be heard. All the kids were stunned as they stared blankly at the center of the cake. Dabai was originally extremely adorable, but now, it was pitifully sliced in half and poured onto the cake. Looking at this tragic murder scene, everyone was shocked. Dabai. It was unknown which brat let out a ghostly wail and howl, but the group of children trembled in fear. Dabai was cut in half. Dabai is dead. Shang'er's eyes reddened. She blinked and choked. Dabai, Chu Ho, this, she turned around and glared at Gu Jinglian. What are you doing? Dividing the cake. Who told you to cut Dabai in half? Gu Jinglian, how else should I cut it? Cut off the head. Chu Ho was speechless. You're just dividing the cake. Do you have to be so bloody? Gu Jinglian was even more speechless. It's just a cake. Why do you have to be so bloody? Seeing the children huddle together and yell, Gu Jinglian and Chu Ho started arguing again. Uncle Fu immediately put on disposable gloves and began to remedy the situation. He lifted the two halves of Dabai and smeared some cream in the middle. However, the two halves were barely glued together. He broke out in cold sweat. Okay. Since Xiao Bao is our birthday boy today, let's give Dabai to him, okay? The group of children regained some energy. Uncle Fu placed the repaired Dabai on Xiao Bao's plate. Xiao Bao held the plate in his hand and walked to Shang'er. He said shyly, Shang'er, you like Dabai the most. I'll give you Dabai, okay? Shang'er nodded with red eyes and immediately smiled through her tears. Uncle Fu began to divide the cake. The children held the cake in their hands and realized that the cake's filling was rainbow-colored. What a beautiful cake. I can't bear to eat it. The next time I celebrate my birthday, I'll ask my mother to buy me a cake like this too. But it should be very expensive, right? The group of children chattered as they munched on the cake. Xiao Bao was eating happily with Shang'er when a few children sneaked up behind him and shouted, Xiao Bao. Xiao Bao had just turned around when his face was suddenly smeared with cake. Happy birthday. Ahahaha. The atmosphere was cheerful and warm. Uncle Fu divided 2 pieces of cake and handed them to Chu Ho and Gu Jinglian. He smiled and said, Old master, it's time to eat the cake. I'm not eating. I know you don't like to eat cake, but today is Xiao Bao's birthday. This cake must be eaten. Only then did Gu Jinglian take it. When Xiao Bao saw Gu Jinglian, he couldn't help but want to tease him. He smeared the cake on both his hands and sneaked behind Gu Jinglian. He giggled and said, Daddy. Gu Jinglian had just turned his head when he saw Xiao Bao reaching out his 2 little paws that were smeared with cream and waving at him. Almost instinctively, Gu Jinglian slapped the cake in his hand onto Xiao Bao's face. The tray gradually slid down. Xiao Bao stood there in a daze. His face was smeared with cake and was unrecognizable. Chu Ho, Uncle Fu, the children immediately roared with laughter. Ha ha ha. Xiao Bao howled, Daddy is a big baddie. Chapter 35:10. Chu Ho couldn't help but laugh. Even though she tried to restrain herself, she still couldn't help but laugh out loud. She had seen fathers who cheated their sons, but she had never seen a father who cheated his sons like this. Ha ha ha. She was halfway through her laughter when Gu Jinglian took the cake and pressed it against her face. Chu Ho couldn't laugh anymore. Cream covered her face, and when she breathed, she inhaled the cream into her nostrils. Chu-ho opened her eyes in embarrassment. Only a pair of dark eyes could be seen on her face that was covered in cream. She looked extremely embarrassed. Xiao Bao and Chu-ho looked at each other with a sense of empathy. Gu Jinglian looked at the mother and son. His originally cold face cracked, and he broke into a smile. His lips curved into a smile. Ha! For some reason, his smile was brighter than the sun outside the window. It was as if the whole world was glowing. He was born handsome, but he was usually unsmiling and had a very cold and serious face. She also rarely saw him smile. Even though he would occasionally curl his lips into a cold smile, it was enough to send chills down people's spines and make them shudder. However, his smile now was a smile from the bottom of his heart. It was as bright as the galaxy. It turned out that a man could be so charming when he smiled. He was a little dazed. It was Xiao Bao who reacted immediately. He pointed at Gu Jinglian in surprise and said in disbelief, "Dad is smiling." It was also his first time seeing Gu Jinglian smile, so he was extremely excited. Gu Jinglian awkwardly regained his cold expression and glared at him with a sullen expression. Xiao Bao immediately felt wronged and said, "Dad, you look good when you smile. Why are you always like an old man? You should smile more." "Shut up." Gu Jinglian suddenly stood up and said, "I'm going back to the study." With that, he turned around, his cold expression returning, and quickly left. Chu-ho and Xiao Bao looked at each other and smiled tacitly. "You naughty brat." Chu-ho lovingly scratched the bridge of his nose. Xiao Bao was about to throw himself into her arms. "Don't come over." Her alarm bells rang, but before she could dodge, Xiao Bao had already thrown himself into her arms and rubbed the cake on her face all over him. Xiao Bao. When the children saw this, they were also infected by the warm and happy atmosphere and laughed. In the afternoon, the children were tired from playing and settled down a lot. At 4 o'clock, parents came to take their children home one after another. Even when it was time to go home, many children were still reluctant to leave. They stood at the door and reluctantly said goodbye to Xiao Bao, obviously reluctant to leave. Many children saw their parents and excitedly described the interesting things that happened that day to them. At 6 o'clock in the evening, all the children except Shang were taken home. Shang was tired from playing and fell asleep in the guest room while hugging Xiao Bao's big bear. However, gradually, Shang's mother still didn't appear until night fell. Chu-ho couldn't help but worry. She called Shang's mother several times, but her phone was turned off. When Shang woke up and saw that her mother still hadn't appeared to pick her up, she was a little unhappy. Although she also liked Xiao Bao's house very much and wanted to play for a while more, her mother still hadn't appeared at this late hour, so she couldn't help but feel a little helpless. When Chu-ho walked into the guest room, Shang went up to her worriedly and asked nervously, "Did you get through to Mom's phone?" "No." Chapter 35:11. Chu-ho explained, "It's turned off. Maybe it's out of battery." "What's going on? Why is it turned off?" Shang felt wronged and said, "Did Mommy forget about me?" Chu-ho smiled and comforted her, "How can that be? Don't think too much. Maybe your mommy got off work late, or maybe she was stuck in a traffic jam." Shang pouted and looked very wronged. She looked like an abandoned stray dog, her eyes red. Xiao Bao walked over and said to Shang, "Don't worry. If your mommy really forgot about you, you can stay at my house tonight. We can sleep together." Why else would they say that children's words carried no harm? With Xiao Bao's EQ and IQ, it was really difficult for him to comfort a girl. It would have been better if he hadn't said that. Now that he said that, Shang really thought that she had been abandoned. Her eyes, which were originally red, were forced to cry. Boo-hoo. Xiang'er wants to go home, Xiang'er said as she walked towards the door. Chu Ho glared at Xiao Bao in disappointment and poked his head. Do you know how to coax girls? Xiao Bao was speechless. Chu Ho said, you'll only scare Xiang'er if you say that. The child was so young. If Xiang'er's mommy didn't come to pick her up, the child would only think that her mommy didn't want her anymore. She wouldn't think of anything else. After all, a child's thoughts were simple and more intuitive. Mommy, Xiang'er ran to the door and stood there, craning her neck to look around. However, the door was cold and cheerless. She looked around for a long time, but it was still in vain. Did Mommy really not want her anymore? Xiang'er sniffled with tears in her eyes. Her two little hands were intertwined, looking extremely worried. Chu Ho saw her standing at the door with an anxious expression. He walked over, squatted beside her, and hugged her thin body. Xiang'er, don't worry. Maybe your mommy has something to do and is late. Boo-hoo, if it's really too late, sleep with Xiao Bao tonight, okay? How is it possible that my mother didn't come to pick me up so late? Jean fiddled with her fingers and said pitifully, does mommy not want Jean any more after you have a baby? Baby? Yes. Only then did Xiang'er tell him about her worries in full detail. It turned out that Xiang'er's mother was pregnant with her second child last month. One night, she pulled Xiang'er in front of her and asked her a serious question, Xiang'er, didn't you always want a younger brother or sister? Xiang'er blinked her eyes in confusion. When she was young, she saw a pair of twins in her neighbor's house. The boy and the girl were always together, holding hands. Xiang'er was very envious and unintentionally mentioned that if she had a younger sister or brother, she wouldn't be lonely. Thus, these words remained in his heart. Some time ago, Xiang'er's mother suspected that she was pregnant and went to the hospital for a checkup. When she found out that she was more than 2 months pregnant, the whole family was very happy. When Xiang heard that her mother was pregnant with a Xiao Bao baby in her stomach, she was very happy. She said, sure. Of course. If I have a younger brother or sister, Xiang will definitely take good care of them. However, when she went to school and told the other children about it, she received a lot of complaints. I hate my younger brother the most. Chapter 35:12. Xiao Bao, tears welled up in Xiang'er's eyes. She placed her little hand on the glass of the window and her eyes were misty. She kept hitting the window and said anxiously, let me out of the car. Let me out of the car. Her aunt looked at her and followed her gaze to the back of the car. She saw a little boy chasing after the car. She asked, Xiang'er, who is this? It's Xiao Bao. It's Xiao Bao. Xiang'er kept crying and throwing tantrums. Stop the car. Stop the car. Gradually, Xiao Bao's figure disappeared from her sight. Xiang'er watched as Xiao Bao disappeared from her sight. Her eyes widened and tears kept flowing down her cheeks. Xiao Bao watched as the car slowly left. He had used up all his energy, but his body was gradually losing strength. His body was on the verge of collapsing and he fell limp to the ground. Xiang'er. Xiang'er, Xiao Bao clenched his little fists and said helplessly, don't go. Ever since Xiang'er left, Xiao Bao had been completely depressed. Even his appetite was not that good. He was depressed in school. When he got home, he would casually eat a few mouthfuls of rice and then run upstairs. He only knew how to lock himself in his room, depressed and lifeless. Chu Ho knew that he was in a bad mood because Xiang'er had transferred schools. However, as an elder, he did not know how to show his concern, so he just let him be. He was afraid that his depression would not dissipate anytime soon. He could only hope that he would accept this fact after a long time. Gu Jinglian, on the other hand, did not know what to do with this child. He heard from Uncle Fu that Xiao Bao had been depressed since Xiang'er transferred schools, but he did not say anything. Uncle Fu said, "Xiao Bao is so young. I didn't expect him to have his first awakening of love. I feel that he likes Xiang'er a little. Now that Xiang'er is gone, he must be lonely. How could such a young child know anything about love?" Gu Jinglian was speechless. "I thought he had always been heartless. I didn't expect him to lock himself in his room all day over such a small matter." Uncle Fu suddenly asked cautiously, "Master, are you leaving early tomorrow morning?" "Yes. I've heard that there are many war zones in North Africa right now. Soldiers are fighting non-stop. You must be very careful when you go there this time. Don't worry. The Gu family had a special pass. Even if they were to pass through the war zone, there would not be any mishaps. I'm not worried about those war zones. I'm just worried, when I'm not around, take good care of Xiao Bao. Don't worry about anything else." After that, Gu Jinglian said, "I'm going to rest. Go and see if Xiao Bao is asleep." "Yes." Uncle Fu left the room. As soon as he left, Chu Ho entered the room and saw him sitting in front of the desk, reading a pile of documents. Most of these documents were from the military headquarters in North Africa. Some of them were the prospectus of Hurricane Group and the acquisition proposal. To put it bluntly, Hurricane Group was going to compete with the Gu family for territory. However, Hurricane Group's methods this time were quite strong. Gu Jinglian originally thought that this acquisition proposal was outlined by Gong Jia. However, when he reached the end, he saw an unfamiliar name, Gong Fan. Gong Fan. He had never heard of this person. Chapter 35:13. She had been influenced by Gong Jia's deeds in Africa. It was said that when Gong Jia was carrying out a trading mission in Africa, he had encountered an armed rebel army. However, the army of hundreds of people was destroyed by Gong Jia's mercenary group in a flash. Hurricane Group controlled Mercenary Paradise. Mercenary Paradise was now the top mercenary organization in the world. Its style of doing things was vicious and merciless. The Gu family had always avoided fighting Hurricane head-on, and Hurricane also respected the Gu family's territory in North Africa. In the end, they did not expect that Hurricane would be the first to provoke them. "Gong Fan. You're going to North Africa tomorrow?" Chu Ho suddenly asked. Gu Jinglian came back to his senses and looked up at her. Chu Ho opened her mouth for a long time, but she could not say a word. She wanted to be concerned. At least when she went to North Africa, she had to be careful. After all, bullets did not have eyes. North Africa was a place where wars were endless. Bullets rained down and artillery fire filled the sky. How many times had she almost lost her life while carrying out missions in North Africa? However, no matter what, she felt that if she really said that, it would be too pretentious. What kind of person was Gu Jinglian? He was such a strong man, so he should be fine. She was worrying too much. Hence, Chu Ho did not say much. She hugged the blanket and lay down on the sofa. Gu Jinglian looked at her meaningfully, then suddenly retracted his gaze and looked down coldly. Early in the morning, he took a private plane and set off for North Africa. More than 20 hours later, the plane landed. Gu Jinglian took an armed car and went straight to the factory headquarters. Along the way, there was continuous artillery fire. Accompanied by the sound of gunshots, the car passed countless battle lines. On the road, by the bridge, by the river, everywhere he looked was filled with casualties. Recently, the war in North Africa has become more and more raging. The senior officer sitting next to Gu Jinglian sighed and said. He was the senior officer appointed by the Gu family in North Africa to be in charge of all the affairs of the factory in North Africa. His name was Gu Yen, and he was a branch of the Gu family. He was very capable when it came to handling matters. Gu Jinglian said coldly, "There is only business when there is war, isn't there? That's true. Gu Yan did not deny it. However, Hurricane Group's recent expansion has been very aggressive. I saw that there was a very unfamiliar name at the end of these documents. Gu Jinglian casually threw a document bag at him and suddenly asked, "Who is Gong Fan?" Gong Fan, I've never heard of this name. Gu Jinglian turned around and raised an eyebrow coldly. This person doesn't seem to be in charge of North Africa. Gong Jia used to be in charge of North Africa's affairs. However, the so-called executor was the person in North Africa. I heard this Gong Fan has a big background. Big what background? The Hurricane Group has been brewing a mysterious plan all this time. However, no one is Fan's eyes big. I only know that Gong Fan is an important part of this plan. Gu Jinglian grunted and closed his eyes to rest. The road was bumpy. Fortunately, the car's off-road performance was top-notch, so it did not feel much bumpiness. After more than 20 hours of travel, he looked indescribably tired. Chapter 35:14. What he wanted to say was that the Gu family would be doomed if they went head-on against Hurricane. This time, the Gu family's position in North Africa might not be able to withstand it. Hurricane had also set up many strategic fortresses in North Africa, as well as many as 12 large-scale military factories. At the same time, Hurricane was also the only private organization in North Africa that had the right to mine oil and natural gas. A black off-road vehicle, escorted by 12 fully armed tanks, drove into the heavily guarded military factory. The off-road vehicle stopped steadily in front of a warehouse. A few mercenaries rushed out of the car and surrounded it. One of the burly mercenaries looked around vigilantly. Even though they were in their own territory, they had to ensure their safety. He walked to the door, opened the door, and said respectfully in a deep voice, "Young master, we're here." After saying that, he knelt on the ground with one knee. The off-road vehicle's chassis was very high. The Toyota Land Cruiser, after being modified by force, was more than 30 centimeters off the ground. Beside the door, a young man in a black cloak held the door frame and stepped on the mercenary's back as he walked down. The mercenary slowly stood up. The young man stood up at a height of 192 meters. When the young man stood up straight, he only reached the mercenary's chest. The cloak was very large, wrapping his entire body in it. The hat was also buttoned up high, covering his entire face. The young man's entire face was buried in the shadows. His facial features and divine appearance could not be seen clearly. One could only vaguely tell that this was probably a very young child, about 8 or 9 years old. Under the cloak, he wore a black shirt and pitch-black trousers that wrapped around his slender and beautiful legs. At the entrance of the warehouse stood a row of men in suits. These were the senior leaders of the Hurricane Group's North Africa affairs. They bowed respectfully, not daring to neglect in the slightest. "Young master." The young man in the cloak slowly walked in front of them and stood still. Then, a slightly feminine and cold voice, with a cold and indifferent tone, came out concisely and comprehensively. "Is the goods here?" "Yes. Everything is in this warehouse. We have checked them one by one. There are no incomplete goods." "Show me." "Yes." The door of the warehouse slowly opened. The cloaked youth walked in with a sullen face. As soon as he stepped in, all the lights in the warehouse lit up. The heavy shutter door fell behind him. The young man lowered his head, raised his fair hand, and slowly grasped the brim of his hat. He brushed the hat to the back of his head, and then, a young but shockingly handsome face was suddenly exposed to the air. The face that entered everyone's line of sight had fair and flawless skin, and a pair of deep eyes that were like deep ancient wells. If one stared at them, it was as if one's soul would be sucked dry. However, calling it an ancient well didn't seem too appropriate. His eyes were like a bottomless abyss at the bottom of the sea. His thick eyelashes were like the feathers of a black phoenix, overlapping layer upon layer, making his eyeliner look very thick. The bridge of her nose was high, and her lips were like cherry blossoms, tender and red. When she spoke, her mouth opened and closed, revealing her shell-like teeth. He was clearly such a handsome child, but his every move was as mature as an adult man's. He could be said to be mature, but at the same time, he could not be considered mature. He was definitely a mature child. Chapter 35:15. Gong Fan. This was definitely a strange yet familiar name to these higher-ups. It was unfamiliar because they had never heard of this child named Gong Fan before. There were only a few people in the Gong family, and Gong Fan was not one of them. However, overnight, Gong Xiaoying announced to everyone that Gong Fan was officially appointed as the person in charge of the Davis Act project. Gong Xiaoying did not say much about this child's identity and origin. He only said that this was the future heir of the Gong family and the successor to his position. He was also the future owner of the Hurricane Group. It was said that this child was only 12 years old. However, everyone who had seen him in person felt that the age of 12 was somewhat exaggerated. This child looked only 8 or 9 years old. What was even more shocking was this child's methods and ability, as well as his outstanding talent in the field of arms and business, were absolutely unprecedented. After he was appointed as the person in charge of the Davis Act project, he began to prepare a series of research and development processes. Everyone knew very well what the Davis Act project meant to the Hurricane Group. If the plan succeeded, the Hurricane Group would become the world's undisputed overlord. Purchasing a few pieces of golden land in North Africa for research and investing hundreds of millions of US dollars as an experimental base was one of them. Nearly $1 billion worth of equipment were divided into batches and transported to the North African site within 10 days. This was the second. Kicking out more than a dozen people in charge of the North African market who were sitting on empty salaries from the Hurricane Group was the third. However, within a month, Gong Fan's name was enough to make many people fearful. Now, he actually wanted to compete with the Gu family for territory in North Africa. It really shocked many people. One had to know that the Gu family's dominance in the North African market was absolutely extraordinary. He was just a child, yet he dared to go against the Gu family. It was unknown if he was a newborn calf that was not afraid of tigers. He actually dared to be so arrogant. The young man walked to a row of shelves. The shelves were covered with a thick layer of dust-proof cloth. He casually lifted it, and the precision instrument parts came into view. He said coldly, "Will the acquisition be tomorrow?" "Yes. I heard that the people from the Gu family have already arrived. We have already sent someone to deal with them. Gu Jinglian will also be there tomorrow night. No matter what, we must make Gu Jinglian sign the agreement." The upper echelons looked at each other in dismay. "Young master, it's not good to offend the Gu family. They are very tight-lipped. I'm afraid it will be difficult to get them to sign the agreement. Yeah, Gu Jinglian is a ruthless character. After all, they have dominated the North African market for many years. It will be difficult for them to remove the North African market. The Gu family's military factories in North Africa have made a lot of profits. Almost 1/5 of the Gu family's income came from this military factory. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for them to give up this piece of land." The youth turned around, his eyes cold and gloomy. "I only look at the results, not the process. If they don't sign, they can forget about leaving North Africa alive." As soon as his voice fell, the crowd could not help but break out in cold sweat from the imposing aura emanating from the youth's body. The rumors were indeed true. Chapter 35:16. This young man was so young, but he was so vicious and merciless. How dare he say such arrogant words? Moreover, I don't want to snatch their market. I only want the land of the Gu family's first factory. This is a condition that cannot be compromised. The young man paused and walked to the side. His gaze landed on the cold equipment on the shelf and he said calmly, either they close the factory and withdraw from the North African market. Or they move the factory to another place. There is no third option. Yes, understood. Everyone bowed their heads, cold sweat dripping down their backs. The young man said, check the equipment and parts again. Don't miss anything. Understood. After the young man left, the higher-ups finally heaved a sigh of relief. The hotel was heavily guarded within a radius of a few miles. In the room, Gong Fan sat on the sofa, holding a file in his hands. His slender and fair fingers flipped through the pages. His eyes scanned through 10 lines at a glance. In his mind, the data was like a gear, calculating rapidly. Lisa brought the black tea to the side table and asked carefully, Master, when are you going to rest? Shoo, Gong Fan put a finger to his lips, indicating for her to keep quiet. Lisa understood and immediately retreated to the side. She walked to the side and hung his coat in the wardrobe. Suddenly, she heard a cough. Only then did she remember that it was already past 8:00 and it was time to take his medicine. Thus, she took the medicine box from the wardrobe and arranged the medicine that he should take one by one. She placed them on a small tray, poured some purified water, and handed it to him. Master, it's time to take your medicine. Gong Fan looked up. A trace of fatigue appeared on his slightly pale face. His gaze was fixed on the colorful pills, and his brows furrowed slightly. Lisa immediately took out the candied fruits from her bag, opened the lid, shook a few out and handed them to him. Only then did Gong Fan take the pills and put them into his mouth. He swallowed them with the purified water and immediately ate a few candied fruits. He was afraid of bitterness. As long as it was slightly bitter medicine, he would only take it with the candied fruits. It's getting late. It's time to rest. Gong Fan nodded, put the file aside, and slowly stood up. When he passed by the balcony, he looked out through the floor-to-ceiling window. He could vaguely see flames and smoke thousands of meters away. The hotel was only a few thousand meters away from the battlefield. However, this was the headquarters of the Hurricane Group. Most of the Chinese factories were located here. Separated by a bridge, a boundary of peace and war was formed. The war in North Africa had reached its climax. At the same time, the sales of weapons continued to increase along with the war. This meant that the North African market had become the focus of Hurricane Group. Gong Fan suddenly pushed open the door and walked to the balcony. The night breeze blew against his face and woke him up a little. Lisa followed closely behind him, only to hear him say faintly, "Listen, what a beautiful sound." Gong Fan closed his eyes and listened to the sound of gunfire coming from not far away. His thin lips curved slightly and his handsome eyebrows raised slightly. Just a few months ago, Gong Xiaoying announced that Gong Fan would be the person in charge of the Heaven's Eye project. Everyone was unfamiliar with this name that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Especially Gong Jia. He did not know who this successor, who had appeared out of nowhere, was. Chapter 35:17. This name was almost the top secret of the Hurricane Group. No one could find out about it. They only knew that this name represented the highest authority. Gong Jia was the chief commander of the Hurricane Group. Before this, other than Gong Xiaoying, everyone obeyed his orders. However, Gong Fan's appearance broke this monopoly. Although Gong Jia was still the chief commander on the surface, the situation in the Hurricane Group had suddenly changed. Gong Fan, a name that had never been heard of before, had almost become the person with the highest authority. And Gong Jia did not expect that this child called Gong Fan was Yu. War, since ancient times, has always been an unsolvable proposition. Gong Fan opened his eyes slightly, and a cold voice slowly came out from his thin lips. Gong Jia actually wanted to use the Sky Eye plan to achieve the goal of peace. Utterly stupid. Lisa frowned, but a strange expression appeared on her face. When the Sky Eye plan was first established, it was only a bold idea of Yu Yu. The so-called Sky Eye plan was to use quantum technology to lock down the sky, control absolute air supremacy, and seal off the world's information. When that day came, even if they wanted to start a war, they could forcefully stop it. When this plan was proposed, everyone in the Hurricane Group had their own ulterior motives. World peace. No war. It was met with opposition from almost everyone. One had to know that the Hurricane Group was born from war. If there was no war in this world, then there would be no Hurricane Group. An overlord group that relied on selling firearms to survive in this world. If there was really no war in this world, then how would the Hurricane Group survive if they lost the firearms business? Where would they sell so many weapons? What was even more unbelievable was that Yu Yu actually had a very positive attitude towards this plan. Locking down the sky and controlling absolute air supremacy would inevitably mean that they would become an overlord that surpassed all countries. As the saying went, it was lonely at the top. Since ancient times, no dynasty had been able to preserve 1,000 years of history. This was because human ambition had always been endless. This was almost a biological instinct. In the animal world, the weak were prey to the strong. Similarly, the human world was the same. Everyone wanted to be the winner. From the petty infighting in the workplace to the disputes of interests between countries, no one had ever been able to retreat from the whirlpool of interests. This was the only law that existed in the world. Whether it was passive or active, humans learned to fight for something from the moment they gained consciousness. Power, wealth, ambition, desire, and even women. Those at the top wanted to secure their throne while those at the bottom wanted to climb up by any means necessary. There had never been a person, a country, or a period of history that could maintain its position as the overlord for more than 1,000 years. World peace. This was the biggest joke of the century. War would only end when people's ambitions withered away. Similarly, civilized society would also regress for hundreds of years, stagnating. However, compared to Yu Yu's ambition, Gong Fan's ambition was even greater. The night breeze blew gently. I want this world's war to be born because of me, and to die because of me. Chapter 35:18. If she had to use a word to describe it, Yu Yu was warmth. Gong Fan, on the other hand, represented destruction. Lisa could still remember when Yu Yu first joined Hurricane. He had vowed, only when I'm strong enough can I protect the people I want to protect. However, when that pure and warm Yu Yu was sealed away forever, he returned as a youth who was so cold that he did not seem to be made of flesh and blood. Only when I'm strong enough can I prevent my fate from being dictated by others. Gong Fan, who had returned, was like a terrifyingly ambitious schemer. Master, Lisa looked up with a conflicted expression and mustered up her courage to ask, do you still remember Yun Tianyu? In her memory, it was Yun Tianyu's warm smile when he smiled at her. However, when their gazes met, the Yu Yu reflected in her eyes had become so cold. Gong Fan turned around expressionlessly and raised a brow. Who is Yun Tianyu? Should I know him? Have you forgotten? You don't remember at all? Gong Fan's voice was as cold as ice. There's no such name in my memory. Therefore, he should be an insignificant person who was not worth keeping memories of. Lisa weakly smiled. If you don't remember, then forget it. She paused for a moment before saying, it's cold. Let's go back to the room. Gong Fan entered the room. Lisa closed the balcony door and looked at his back thoughtfully. The next night. In the hotel's conference hall. When Gu Jinglian arrived, it was already 7 in the evening. On his way here, he passed by the war zone and was delayed for some time. When he reached the conference hall, it was filled with people in black suits. These were the Hurricane Group's North African market executives. A youth in a black cloak sat at the table with his back facing him. The brim of his hat was pulled up high to cover his entire face. His subordinate beside him reminded him that this youth in a black cloak was Gong Fan. Why is it a child? This is my first time seeing him, too. I didn't expect it to be such a young child. Just as Gu Jinglian was about to walk in, one of his subordinates pulled him back and said worriedly, "Mr. Gu, I'm worried that this is a trap." It was said that there were very few people who had seen Gong Fan's face. Most of the people who had seen him in person no longer existed. One could imagine how ruthless this child was. He was simply like the Grim Reaper. So what? Gu Jinglian looked back and said coldly, "From the moment I stepped into North Africa, I had already entered Hurricane's territory. Since we're already here, let's take things as they come." Gu Jinglian walked in and sat down at the table. Hearing the footsteps behind him, Gong Fan slowly turned around and looked at him. His lips curled up coldly. "You're 3 minutes late." "Oh." Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows but did not think much of it. "So, is there any punishment for being late?" "That depends on your performance." The youth's voice was very cold. He raised his hand and a man beside him immediately walked over and handed him a document. Gong Fan pushed the document in front of him and said lightly, "You should have already read this agreement." "Yes, I have." Gu Jinglian's gaze fell on the document and he laughed mockingly. "So, you invited me here not to negotiate with me at all, but to let me sign my name directly." Chapter 35:19. "Oh. Then, what if I don't sign it?" Gu Jinglian suddenly pushed the document away. His expression was equally cold. The young man looked up slightly. Under the cloak, his face was buried in the shadows, and it was impossible to see his face clearly. The entire conference hall was dominated by the people from the Hurricane Group. However, even so, Gu Jinglian still looked calm and composed. He sat at the table calmly, facing Gong Fan. Invisibly, the auras of the two people fiercely clashed several times. They were actually evenly matched. Lisa, who was standing behind Gong Fan, looked at Gu Jinglian. She actually felt that this man had the same temperament as Gong Fan. Cold and icy. Even in such a tense atmosphere, his aura did not lose out at all. Gong Fan said, "You have to sign it." "Why?" Gu Jinglian glanced at the document and crossed his arms arrogantly. "I can't accept the unfair terms on the document. Similarly, I, Gu Jinglian, am also a capitalist of the Hurricane Group. Capitalists don't make meaningless deals. It's your business if you want this piece of land. If I don't give it to you, it's my attitude." Gong Fan suddenly sneered and said slowly, "The terms on this document can't be said to be unfair to you." "What do you mean?" The young man said coldly, "There are many ways to deal with real inequality. Similarly, there are many ways for me to get that piece of land. I can buy it. Similarly." Pausing, his upper body slightly leaned forward. Beneath his cloak, a pair of deep eyes stared at him without blinking. He enunciated each word clearly. "I can also raise your military factory to the ground in a single night. At most, I'll blow up this piece of land into ruins and rebuild it." "Ha!" Gu Jinglian frowned and narrowed his eyes. However, the corners of his lips curled into a mocking smile and he let out a contemptuous sneer. "Are you threatening me?" "That depends on what you think. You can't threaten me with just you." Gu Jinglian mocked, "The Hurricane Group is so powerful. Why would they go against the Gu family? There are so many pieces of land in North Africa, and you picked the one in my hands. Cut the crap." A man beside Gong Fan slammed the table and angrily pointed at Gu Jinglian, saying, "You have to sign today whether you want to or not. Otherwise, don't even think about leaving." Before he could finish his sentence, Gu Jinglian gave him an impatient look. The mercenaries behind him immediately stepped forward, took out their guns, and aimed between the man's eyebrows. With a bang, they fired. In less than a minute, the arrogant and overbearing man had already fallen to the ground, turning into an ice-cold corpse. Fresh blood continued to seep onto the ground, dyeing it red. The man's eyes were wide open. Even in death, he maintained an angry expression. Gu Jinglian said coldly, "No one has the right to interrupt me when I'm speaking." Gong Fan glanced sideways dangerously and frowned slightly. Behind him, the mercenaries of the Hurricane Group immediately raised their pistols and aimed accurately between Gu Jinglian's eyebrows. The mercenaries behind Gu Jinglian immediately raised their hands and aimed their submachine guns at Gong Fan. In an instant, the two sides faced each other with swords drawn. However, Gong Fan, who was pointed at by dozens of guns, still sat motionless on the chair without any fear. Chapter 35-20. Gong Fan glanced at the mercenaries behind Gu Jinglian from the corner of his eye. He glanced sideways and signaled with his eyes. Lisa, who was behind him, immediately understood. Facing so many mercenaries from the Gu family, she walked calmly to the mercenary who had shot Gong Fan's subordinate. She grabbed his throat and twisted it tightly with her knuckles. That mercenary couldn't help but smile mockingly. The person standing in front of him and strangling his throat was only a girl of about 10 years old. She had such a small figure, especially her hands, which were small and thin. Did she think that she could break his throat? What kind of joke was this? However, before a mocking laugh could come out of his throat, Lisa's fingertips were filled with strength. She suddenly released her grip and the mercenary's throat was broken. A crisp, crack sound was heard. It was extremely crisp and clean. In the next second, the mercenary didn't even have time to resist. His body fell down and leaned against the wall weakly. He twitched violently and stopped moving. She killed without spilling blood. With just one hand, she ended the life of an adult mercenary. A little girl under Gong Fan actually had such terrifying combat power. In an instant, everyone was even more vigilant. However, they saw Lisa return behind the youth. She lowered her eyes and the hostility on her face gradually faded. She was like a killing machine, ready to be ordered at any time. And the only master in her eyes was the silent youth sitting in his seat. Gu Jinglian narrowed his eyes slightly. However, he heard Gong Fan's low voice slowly ring out. Gu Jinglian, you and I are both capitalists. Since we are capitalists, we will never do a business that is at a loss. In other words, you hurt my subordinate's life. Naturally, you have to use your subordinate's life in exchange. When Gu Jinglian heard this, he was slightly stunned. Then, his lips curled up into a smile. You are so young, but you are so arrogant. Such ruthless methods are really not simple. However, Gong Fan sneered. You dare to go against me. You are not simple either. His arrogant tone didn't give in at all. The two of them sat opposite each other. Their auras clashed, but for a moment, it was hard to tell who was superior. Although the scene was deathly silent, the shadows of swords and sabers could be seen everywhere. Gu Jinglian was the first to break the silence. Since I dared to come here, I have some confidence. This hotel has long been surrounded by the Hurricane Group's people. I'm afraid it'll be difficult for me to leave. Gong Fan remained silent. Gu Jinglian continued, Hurricane Group wants to buy the land in my hands for nothing more than to develop the Heavenly Eye project. If this land is used as a test site, with its unique electric energy field, it is indeed the best choice. However, I will not sign this agreement. Of course, I don't have to worry about you raising my factory to the ground. Gong Fan raised his eyebrows but did not think much of it. Oh. How do you know? Gu Jinglian inched closer to him and gave him a devilish smile. He enunciated each word clearly. Because there are thousands of fuses buried under this ground. Once one is touched, it will instantly detonate the explosives buried underground. When that happens, it will be like dominoes. Everything within a radius of a few hundred miles will be devastated. After a pause, he said meaningfully, "You could try blowing one up." Gong Fan's usually cold and dead face finally revealed a slightly stunned expression. He didn't expect Gu Jinglian to be so generous as to bury so many explosives underground. Chapter 35-21. Gu Jinglian said casually, "Even if you spend a lot of effort to rebuild it, this explosion will definitely destroy the electromagnetic field here. In that case, this piece of land will be completely destroyed." Even though this was not a big deal to the rich and powerful hurricane, this was the only place in the entire world where the electromagnetic field was unique. Other than here, there is no other magnetic field station. Gong Fan narrowed his dark eyes slightly, and his body overflowed with hostility. The air seemed to freeze because of this, and it was suffocating. "How much explosives did you bury?" Gu Jinglian smiled leisurely. "It's enough to blow up an entire Atlanta island." "Impossible. The power of explosives alone would never produce such a strong explosive force." "It's impossible, but you seem to have neglected that other than explosives, there is abundant natural gas underground." A year ago, Gu Jinglian had already expected this. At that time, Hurricane had already set their eyes on this piece of land. After exploration, the rich natural gas and oil underground became the target of many capitalists. Therefore, he buried tons of explosives in advance. Explosives were not scary. What was scary was the natural gas. When it encountered explosives or open flames, there would be no life within a radius of hundreds of miles. In just a moment, the initiative of the situation had been overturned. Gu Jinglian had the absolute right to speak. In other words, it was either you don't covet this piece of land of mine, or you can openly snatch it or raze it to the ground. At worst, we'll die together. The Gu family would only lose a piece of land, but the Hurricane family would lose the only electromagnetic field station in the world. It had to be said that Gu Jinglian was very shrewd. He knew how to grasp the pros and cons. He hit the nail on the head and took the initiative from the passive side. When Gong Fan heard this, he was silent for a long time. Then, he suddenly curled his lips and let out a cold laugh. "Rumor has it that the head of the Gu family is young but ruthless. Today, I have experienced it." Gong Fan paused, but his eyebrows were slightly furrowed. "However, it is said that you have a 7-year-old son named Gu Qingze." Before he finished speaking, Gu Jinglian's face suddenly froze. "Other than that, you also have a wife named Chu Ho." However, Chu Ho's background was not as simple as the information stated. She should be the former Interpol's top anti-crime inspector. Who would have thought that she would be married to the capital's #1 heiress? How ironic. Gu Jinglian's eyes flashed with a cold light. Gong Fan observed his reaction seriously and immediately became interested. "What? You seem to care a lot about them." Gu Jinglian did not say a word, but his eyes were cold and vigilant. "Gu Jinglian, I'm surprised that someone of your status would get married and have a child." Gu Jinglian remained silent. "Rumor has it that the head of the Gu clan is heartless and cold." Gong Fan leaned slightly against the back of the chair and said lightly, "With your status, if you have a weakness, it will inevitably be a hindrance. Do you need me to get rid of them for you?" Gu Jinglian immediately said coldly, "How dare you?" Gong Fan said casually, "I'm just being kind. I don't want these 2 extra people to drag you down. With your status, if you have concerns, it means that you have a weakness. Such a weakness will definitely become a stumbling block for you." Chapter 35-22. After a pause, Gong Fan rested his chin on his hand lazily and enjoyed Gu Jinglian's livid expression. He said slowly, "Look, if I use your wife and son's lives to threaten you to sign this agreement, will you sign it or refuse to sign it? His tone seemed calm, but it was full of threat. Gu Jinglian glared at him. His hands on the table gradually clenched into fists. He clenched his fists tightly and revealed his sharpness. Behind Gong Fan, the sound of a gun being loaded gradually came. If he dared to make any moves, he would definitely be shot to death on the spot. You're threatening me. That depends on whether you're willing to accept my threat. Even if he had to fight to the death, Gong Fan was determined to take down this experimental base station. The success of the Deva plan depended on whether this piece of land could be successfully acquired. Therefore, to Gong Fan, this agreement was no ordinary agreement. Gu Jinglian suddenly let out a cold laugh. Why should I believe you? If I sign this agreement, will you let my wife and son go? Compared to the Gu family, the Hurricane Group's methods were even more ruthless and unscrupulous. So what if he signed this agreement? Since Gong Fan had investigated Gu Qingze and Chu Ho's information and even knew their movements, he could pose a threat to them at any time. Let's not talk about the distant, but the near. Now, even if he signed the agreement, he might not be able to leave alive. Before this negotiation, Gu Jinglian and Gong Fan each had a chance of winning. They were very conceited that they could win this battle. However, they each miscalculated. Gong Fan did not expect that Gu Jinglian would bury so many explosives under this piece of land. And Gu Jinglian did not expect that in such a short period of time, Gong Fan had already investigated Chu Ho and Gu Qingze's identities and backgrounds. In the face of the powerful Hurricane Group, the Gu family's last bargaining chip was not very persuasive. Gu Jinglian slowly closed his eyes. It was lonely at the top. With his status, falling in love was tantamount to touching the door of death. Wandering in such a bloody storm, what one feared the most was having one's weakness grasped by others. This inch of weakness was enough to be fatal. Therefore, he had always maintained a distant relationship with women. Even though he had had women before, without exception, he had never fallen in love. He knew very well that if he were to fall in love with her, it would undoubtedly expose his Achilles heel. Despicable. Yes, I'm despicable. Gong Fan sneered. Could it be that this is the first time you've seen Hurricane's way of doing things? I've never claimed to be a gentleman. I'll do whatever it takes to achieve my goals. That's my style of doing things. His gaze fell on the agreement again and he said casually, sign it. Don't worry, I don't like to shoot from the back. If you sign him, I'll let you leave North Africa safely. Gu Jinglian was so angry that he laughed and gritted his teeth. Then how should I thank you? He took the agreement and held the pen in his hand. Looking at the column of the agreement, he said, permanently cede the ownership of 500 mu of land in Mufelu. His eyes were almost overflowing with scarlet. What? I can't accept it. Gong Fan raised his eyebrows casually. Look, what an angry expression. But, I like it. Chapter 35-23. Lisa stood behind Gong Fan. Every word that came out of his mouth did not sound like something a person of flesh and blood would say. Even an emotionless killing machine like her felt a chill run down her spine when she heard these words. The bright and sunny Yu of the past seemed to have disappeared from this body forever. Now, the 9-year-old child in front of her, who was extremely mature, was more like a sick and paranoid devil. He used his admiring gaze to admire every loser who crawled at his feet. Ever since he became Gong Fan, his methods had become even more cold-blooded and emotionless. But for some reason, in the past, she despised Yu for being too soft-hearted. He always had that innocent and romantic look, pure and harmless. Instead, it made her feel that she was an out-and-out devil who killed people without batting an eyelid. But now, facing such a Gong Fan, she suddenly missed that bright smile. Every time she thought of it, she would feel warm. However, when she returned to reality, she knew very well that such a Yu would never come back to life. Lisa's face was filled with disappointment. After Gu Jinglian signed the agreement, when he pressed his thumbprint on the signature area, it meant that he had lost in this smokeless war. He had actually lost to this child. He was indignant, very indignant. He had lost completely. Ever since he became the head of the Gu family, no one had ever made him suffer a loss. He had always been a high-spirited man. However, under the influence of some unknown emotion, he actually signed this name as if he was possessed by gods and demons. He could have resisted signing it. But Gong Fan had used Gu Qingze and Chu Ho to threaten him. He could not ignore it. Perhaps, as he had said, he did not know when he had developed a concern in his heart. This concern had become his most fatal weakness at the same time. After Gu Jinglian signed the agreement, someone came over to take it away and handed it to Gong Fan for him to look through. Outside the window, the evening wind suddenly blew, and the hat on his head fell. The cloak and hat fell off his shoulders, revealing the youth's delicate and handsome face. On his fair face, his eyes were cold, and the indifference between his eyebrows seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. The moment Gu Jinglian saw his face, he was slightly stunned. This face was extremely familiar. Yun Tianyu. He still remembered that when Xingyu Financial Group held a press conference, Mu Yaja, who was already the chairman of Xingyu, had gathered more than 100 media reporters and announced Yun Tianyu's identity on the spot. Gu Jinglian also happened to see this news. In the camera, Yun Tianyu stood beside Mu Yaja with an obedient smile on his face. He looked like a well-mannered little gentleman. However, the two children's faces. Yun Tianyu. Calms. How troublesome. The mercenaries behind Gu Jinglian immediately stepped forward and fired. In an instant, smoke filled the air. The row of mercenaries behind him were all shot and fell into a pool of blood, their hearts beating out of them. Gong Shaoying had ordered that anyone who had seen Gong Fan's face should not be allowed to live. Chapter 35-24. Seeing that none of his subordinates survived in less than half a minute, Gu Jinglian's face was filled with shock. Dark clouds and anger gathered between his brows. One of the mercenaries walked in front of Gu Jinglian and raised his wrist. The desert eagle in his hand was aimed at Gu Jinglian's temple. He turned his head to look at Gong Fan. As long as he gave the order, he would immediately pull the trigger. Master, how should we deal with this person? Gong Fan raised his eyes coldly and said expressionlessly, I said before, let him leave safely. When the mercenary heard this, he immediately put away the desert eagle and returned behind Gong Fan. Gong Fan said, let's go. Gu Jinglian was extremely surprised. He actually let him go and let him leave. Gu Jinglian pursed his lips and looked at him with disdain. Don't play this trick. Don't tell me that if I turn around, someone will point a gun at me. Gong Fan said calmly, no one will shoot. Gu Jinglian was speechless. I will do what I say. This is also one of the principles of a capitalist. Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows and suddenly stood up. He said word by word, you said it. After saying that, he suddenly turned around and walked towards the door. Behind him, one of the mercenaries saw that Gong Fan really let Gu Jinglian go. He gritted his teeth and reached for his waist belt. He gripped his gun tightly and suddenly pulled it out and loaded it. The cold muzzle of the gun was aimed straight at Gu Jinglian's back. His finger was on the trigger, ready to fire at any moment. Bang! A loud sound was heard. A gunshot exploded behind him. Gu Jinglian paused in his steps and looked sideways. From the corner of his eye, he saw that the mercenary who was waiting for an opportunity to sneak an attack had been shot and fell to the ground. He held his wrist that was shot and widened his eyes in disbelief as he looked at Gong Fan. Master, if you let the tiger return to the mountain, it will definitely become a threat in the future. Gong Fan leaned lazily against the back of the chair. His fingertips tapped on the table casually, and his expression was obviously a little impatient. I don't need you to teach me what to do. He's Gu Jinglian, and the Gu family is a big business. If he's allowed to leave North Africa, the consequences will be unimaginable. Shut up. Gong Fan said coldly, if you continue talking nonsense, you can go and die. The mercenary was so shocked that he shut his mouth, not daring to say anything else. Gu Jinglian left without looking back. Gong Fan slowly stood up, put on his hat, and walked towards the door. Lisa immediately followed. In the car, the two of them sat in silence. Lisa turned to look at the side of Gong Fan's face and clenched her fists tightly. When she thought of his cold words and actions at the negotiation table earlier, she hesitated for a moment. She suddenly tried to say a name. Yun Shishir. Gong Fan's expression did not change at all. He turned around and frowned slightly. It was obvious that he felt unfamiliar and puzzled by the name that came out of her mouth. What? Master, do you still remember this name? Yun Shishir. Gong Fan frowned and pondered for a moment. Then he asked coldly, should I remember this name? Lisa was stunned. For a moment, she did not know how to respond. Gong Fan asked again, who is she? She is, Lisa hesitated. When she saw that Gong Fan had really forgotten any memory of Yun Shishir, for some reason, her heart ached. Gong Fan said coldly, if it's a meaningless person, I naturally won't have any impression of her. After saying that, he looked out of the window again. Chapter 35-25. At the Gu residence. Chu Ho was lying flat on the bed with her arms under her head. She looked at the night sky outside the window, her thoughts in a mess. For some reason, her eyelids were twitching violently. After Gu Jinglian left, she had insomnia for 2 nights. She would toss and turn in bed until the wee hours of the morning before she could fall asleep. When she woke up the next day, she would go to work early and return home exhausted. At night, she would have insomnia for no reason. It was the same for 2 consecutive days, and she was exhausted. For some reason, she had an ominous feeling in her heart. Gu Jinglian went to North Africa. The next day, the news reported that the war in North Africa was gradually expanding, and the peacekeeping forces were about to intervene. Ever since the war started, North Africa had been divided into 3 regions. One was the war zone, one was the neutral zone, and the last was the peaceful zone. However, the war had already spread to the neutral zone, and several of the Gu family's major factories were built in the neutral zone. If the war spread, it would affect the Gu family's businesses. It was said that several airports in North Africa would be bombed into ruins. All air routes would be stopped, and international traffic would be paralyzed. This meant that many people would not be able to leave North Africa by plane. If they could not leave in time, they would become sacrifices for the war. This war had caused heavy civilian casualties, and various countries had begun to evacuate their nationals. Many people from developed countries had left early. China had also begun to evacuate its nationals on a large scale. Many of the Chinese factories in North Africa were now empty, leaving behind empty factories. The Chinese gathered at the country's embassy, waiting for orders to evacuate their nationals. The ship in charge of evacuating the nationals had already rushed to several major ports in North Africa. It was estimated that the evacuation would be completed within 3 days. Then, what about Gu Jinglian? If he continued to stay in North Africa, he would be in danger. She had to admit that this was a very strong man. Even the most powerful mercenaries were no match for him. However, it was the era of firearms. No matter how strong one's body was, it would be difficult to withstand cannons and bullets. Chu Ho asked Uncle Fu about Gu Jinglian, but Uncle Fu replied that communications were cut off and they could not contact the person in charge of the factory. There was no news, this meant that Gu Jinglian's life was in danger. Chu Ho did not feel good about it. She didn't know why. She clearly hated this man, but at this juncture, she was actually worried about him. Chu Ho turned over and hugged the pillow in his arms. He closed his eyes and forced himself not to let his imagination run wild. The door was suddenly pushed open. Butler Fu rushed in with a panicked expression and said in a panic, "Chu He. Something's wrong." Chu Ho suddenly sat up from the bed in shock and stared at him in a daze. When he met Uncle Fu's panicked gaze, the uneasiness in his heart suddenly expanded to its maximum. "What?" "I've received news that the Gu family's business in North Africa has been taken over by hurricane. All the employees who stayed behind in the factory have been expelled. He even said that the mercenaries who followed Master are all gone." "It's gone." "Yes," Uncle Fu nodded, his voice trembling. "I heard that Master signed an agreement." When the negotiation ended, the dozens of mercenaries he brought with him were all shot dead on the spot. Chu He was dumbfounded by his words. Chapter 35-26. Why did he sign that agreement? Chu Ho was a little confused. "Gu Jinglian mentioned this to me. He said that he would not give up this business to Hurricane no matter what. Why did he sign the agreement?" Uncle Fu's face twitched violently. He clenched his fists and said with some difficulty, "My men told me that Hurricane is using Xiao Bao and you as a hostage. If you don't sign the agreement, I'm afraid that it will be disadvantageous to you. Old Master might be worried about you, so..." When Chu Ho heard this, he was stunned. The corners of his lips twitched, but he still didn't believe it. "That's impossible. Gu Jinglian is such an arrogant person. How could he give up such a big business for Xiao Bao and me?" Uncle Fu sighed and said, "Chu Ho, you might not be able to do it, but the onlooker sees more clearly. In Old Master's eyes, you are different from others. Maybe you think that Old Master is arrogant, but from what I see, ever since Xiao Bao came to the Gu family, Old Master has changed a lot." Chu Ho was speechless for a moment. Even though Old Master might not be like other fathers, and he might not be as gentle or patient, but he cares a lot about anything that threatens Xiao Bao. Old Master is not good with words, but that doesn't mean that I'm not a good father. Uncle Fu continued, "Old Master cares a lot about Xiao Bao. That was why he forced you to sign that agreement and threatened you to give up Xiao Bao's custody. If you were determined not to sign it, Old Master could have forced you to give in. However, he took into consideration the feelings between you and Xiao Bao, so he allowed you to stay in the Gu family. He even got a marriage certificate with you. Maybe it's hard for you to believe that a man like Old Master would fall in love with any woman. But from what I see, he really treats you differently. Maybe you are really special to him." With Old Master's temperament, he was destined not to be like other people, falling in love to the point of death. However, a person like him would never allow anyone to threaten his family. Chu Ho's lips suddenly trembled. She suddenly stood up, but her expression was surprisingly calm. "Uncle Fu, were all the airports in North Africa destroyed? Are you going to North Africa to find him? Answer my question first." Uncle Fu was stunned. He immediately nodded and said, "Yes, then, how can we get to North Africa?" "You can use a freighter," Uncle Fu said. "The Gu family has a batch of firearms that are about to be shipped to North Africa, but it's a single flight. There's no return flight. Solo flight. Yes, it's very difficult to enter and leave North Africa now. The situation is tense. This cargo ship was sent by the North African military, so it's only a single route. When are we leaving?" Uncle Fu finally couldn't take it anymore. "Chu Ho, don't take the risk. Tonight or tomorrow night?" "Today." "Today, tonight." Chu Ho raised her eyebrows in understanding and said, "Help me pack my luggage." I'm leaving tonight. Uncle Fu was shocked. Are you crazy? It's too risky for you to go to North Africa now. Chu Ho said firmly, I want to bring him back. No. It's too risky. Chu Ho, don't be too rash. Chapter 35:27. Uncle Fu wanted to say something, but Chu Ho suddenly turned around and grabbed him by the collar. She said word by word, Uncle Fu, let me tell you. Although I may not be Gu Jinglian's match in terms of fighting skills, I've been through a lot. But in terms of experience, I once crossed the battlefront alone and safely brought a hostage out of the center of the war. I was also chased by the enemy when I was on a mission. I was seriously injured, but I still managed to pass through the rainforest. Before I joined Interpol, I also joined the peacekeeping force. I'm very familiar with the terrain of North Africa. Gu Jinglian can't compare to this experience. Uncle Fu was so frightened by her hostility that he didn't say a word. Chu Ho stared at him and suddenly laughed coldly. Why? Do you think I want to take this risk? If Gu Jinglian dies in North Africa, it has nothing to do with me. But he's Xiao Bao's father. I can't sit back and do nothing when there's no news of him. How are you going to find him? Uncle Fu said, North Africa is so big, and there's war everywhere. How are you going to find him? And how are you going to bring him back? North Africa is very big, but you said that Gu Jinglian is in neutral territory. Then, at least the range is locked in. If war breaks out, then other than the asylum station, the embassy, and the Prime Minister's residence, we can eliminate them one by one. Then we can locate his location. Uncle Fu was confused, but hearing her solemn vow, he thought that she probably had the confidence to bring Gu Jinglian back safe and sound. So, he nodded reluctantly. If you don't have full confidence, don't take the risk. Too bad. I'm just a bag of old bones. I can't help much. Chu Ho curled her lips into a smile and appeared relaxed. You stay here and take good care of Xiao Bao. Okay, I'll take good care of Xiao Bao. You said that Hurricane Group used Xiao Bao and me as a threat to force Gu Jinglian to sign the agreement. After squatting for a while, Chu Ho said, to ensure Xiao Bao's safety, don't go to school for the time being. Ask for leave from the kindergarten. All right, Uncle Fu helped her pack and walked to Xiao Bao's room. In Xiao Bao's room, Chu Ho quietly walked to the bedside and bent over slightly. Looking at the sleeping child, he frowned slightly. He was reluctant to part with him. Chu Ho gently caressed his forehead, closed his eyes, and planted a kiss between his eyebrows. Good night, Xiao Bao. She hoped that the next time she said good night, it would be with Gu Jinglian. She swore to herself that she would bring Gu Jinglian back for the sake of Xiao Bao. The cargo ship that was scheduled to depart at 3 in the morning set off an hour earlier. Chu Ho caught up with the cargo ship in advance. Carrying a huge battlefield bag, she boarded the ship to North Africa. This cargo ship would take about 4 days and 4 nights to reach North Africa. However, this was almost the fastest way of transportation at the moment. The route was disrupted. It was said that in the war, all the railway tracks were blown to pieces by the rebels. The airport, cargo, and all other transportation were in a state of paralysis. Even if it took 4 days and 4 nights, it was the most optimistic speed. If it was slow, it might not even reach the neutral zone in North Africa in a week. To reach the port, they still had to pass through the flames of war and advance into the neutral zone. Chapter 35:29. Chu Ho was confident because she was already familiar with the terrain of North Africa. Even if the entire area was bombed to ashes, she could still recognize it from memory. When she was still in the peacekeeping force, she had gone deep into the battlefield and was responsible for patrolling the neutral and peaceful areas. At that time, the flames of war had already begun. However, in the blink of an eye, many years had passed, and the war still showed no signs of stopping. Even though the ceasefire agreement was signed 3 years ago, it had only been a year since the ceasefire, and local wars were still reignited. Now, it had become an international war. She could not help but suspect that Hurricane Group was fanning the flames. Hurricane Group had the ability to control the situation. Although the ceasefire was due to the intervention of the Shi forces, the anti-government forces had never given up on the idea of starting a war. However, the various countries controlled the military and took drastic measures to prevent the flames of war from spreading. Hurricane Group sold weapons secretly at low prices to the military and started the war again. Because of the weapons blockade and the anti-war prohibition agreement, the sales of any weapons to North Africa were strictly prohibited. Hurricane Group sold weapons of mass destruction to the Jingfu army and sold some to the anti-government forces at low prices. Just like that, the two sides started fighting again. Hurricane Group had always been on Interpol's top blacklist. Gong Xiaoying and Gong Jie had always been at the top of the blacklist. However, with Hurricane Group's great influence and stable position, Interpol did not even have the ability to interfere. Hurricane Group was too powerful and had always been regarded as a thorn in the side of the various countries. However, no one could defeat it. The cargo ship sailed on the sea. Chu Ho stayed in the cabin. Outside the window, there were black men walking around. These were the Jingfu army, responsible for escorting weapons. Part of North Africa used to be civilian land, so the official language was English. Chu Ho's English was first class. However, it was a special period now, so it was better not to walk around the cabin so as to avoid causing trouble. The journey at sea was especially slow. Every day was very torturous. After a short period of adaptation, Chu Ho overcame many obstacles. At first, she was not used to it. In addition, the food on the ship was difficult to describe in words. It was either potatoes or bread. It was extremely disgusting. However, no matter how disgusting it was, she had to swallow it. 5 days later, the ship finally arrived safely at the port. The port was located in the peace zone. When she landed, she heard that parts of the neutral zone had already fallen. There were countless casualties, and many areas had been occupied by anti-government forces. Hence, most of the Jingfu army had already retreated from the neutral zone. As for the rest, most of them had probably been captured. War was especially cruel. A precious life in a war was no different from a bullet. In war, humanity was obliterated incisively and vividly. Soldiers, civilians, and even children who did not know the ways of the world, without exception, could not survive. She watched helplessly as a child was run over by a tank and was badly mutilated. She saw with her own eyes a soldier holding an AK gun and shooting at a helpless civilian. Their intestines and stomachs were torn apart. She also saw all kinds of corpses lying messily on the ground on the streets and in the wasteland. They were as lowly as ants, that was why she hated war. Abhorrence. Chapter 35:30. Chu Ho hired a driver from the front line for $100, some food and water, and successfully bribed him. Because of the outbreak of war, his family had lost their source of food. They even resorted to eating tree bark and soil to survive. Before the driver sent her to the front line, he went home and gave all the food to his wife and daughter. Then, he drove her to the front line. Along the way, the driver was curious why she wanted to go to the front line with such a big bag. At this time, even the Jingfu army, including many unavoidably, could only think of ways to escape from the war zone. He found it strange to meet someone who wanted to go to the front line, so he asked curiously in broken English, "Are you a war correspondent?" "No." "Then why do you want to go to the front line?" "It's raining bullets there. There are anti-government troops and corpses everywhere. It's hell." The driver smiled and said, "But I already sent 2 batches of war correspondents to the front line this morning." In the end, one of the correspondents was shot as soon as he got out of the car. I dragged him back. Luckily, he survived. When did the war break out? The driver sighed and said helplessly, a few days ago. Logically speaking, the neutral zone shouldn't have fallen. But because of the war between the two sides, the situation expanded. Coupled with the intervention of other countries, the neutral zone was about to fall. Now, has the neutral zone fallen? What about the personnel from the other countries? They've all evacuated. Do you know about the military factory in Worth? Worth? You're going to Worth? Yes. Worther has been shut down. All the factory workers have been dismissed. Many of the employees are locals. Those who can evacuate have already evacuated. Those who didn't manage to evacuate in time are trapped there. Chu Ho was speechless. She planned to go to Worth first, which was the Gu family's military factory. Then, she would follow the factory and search from other routes. Uncle Fu was also trying to contact Gu Jinglian. Although they had lost contact, they might be able to locate him. It started to rain heavily. From Tripoli to Sirte, it took more than 4 hours to drive along the coast. The road was muddy and overgrown with weeds. It was very difficult to walk. In the evening, the heavy rain made the road even more bumpy. In addition, there were no street lights, so it was pitch black ahead. One of the car's high-beam headlights was also broken, so it was difficult to illuminate the road ahead. The chauffeur suggested, "Why don't we make do for the night and leave when the sun rises?" "Are you tired?" "I'm not tired. At night, you won't be able to see the road ahead clearly. You might encounter an ambush. It's very dangerous." Chu Ho nodded in tacit agreement. On the way, they came across a rundown hotel. Chu Ho carried his bag and entered the hotel with the driver. When the owner saw the door being pushed open, he instinctively hid behind the counter, trembling in fear. In the past few days, there had been no end to the war. Many soldiers had come to rob the place. Because of this, everyone was on high alert. The driver quickly said, "We're not soldiers. They're civilians." The owner heaved a sigh of relief and said, "The hotel is closed. We have to pack up and leave tomorrow morning. This place is full of anti-government troops. How dare you come here?" Chapter 35-31. When the boss saw the money, he nodded and gave them the keys. Chu Ho and the driver were in 2 rooms. The hotel there was cheap, but the environment was quite bad. When she opened the door, she saw the dilapidated facilities. There were bullet holes on the wall from submachine gun shots. It was a scene of devastation. She locked the door from the inside and walked into the room. A foul smell assailed her nostrils. There was a musty smell on the bed. Chu Ho sniffed it. It was not hard to tell that it was a mixture of blood and sweat that had accumulated over a long period of time. There were no windows in the room and it was airtight. Hence, the musty smell was very strong. The bathroom was dirty and messy. However, it was better than sleeping outside. Chu Ho threw her bag on the bed and leaned against it. She hugged her chest and closed her eyes. In the middle of the night, there was a sudden movement at the door. She was always alert and immediately noticed the strange movements at the door. The lights were on in the room. She opened one eye gently and saw that the door was pushed open. 2 heads were moving around outside the door as if they were checking out the situation in the room. Chu Ho did not make a sound and pretended to be asleep. When the 2 people saw that she was asleep, they crept into the room quietly. When the 2 of them were exposed to the light, Chu Ho recognized them immediately. They were the driver and the boss. The 2 of them were communicating in the local dialect in a low voice. They knew that Chu Ho could understand English, so they communicated in the local dialect. However, they probably did not expect that Chu Ho, who often traveled in and out of North Africa, had a rough grasp of the local language. This woman seems to be very rich. Do you see that bag? It was the driver's voice. I see a lot of food, water, and a lot of cash in the bag. How much is there? There must be tens of thousands of US dollars. Oh my God, the boss gasped. That's a big piece of meat. Chu-ho suddenly understood that the driver and the boss knew each other. Perhaps they were in cahoots. She went through the whole process. When they arrived, the driver took the initiative to ask to stay at a hotel for the night. As luck would have it, he ended up in this hotel. Many civilians in North Africa were very poor. Because of the war, they did not have fresh food reserves. Therefore, violent incidents of robbing Chinese shops were endless. The driver probably saw that she had money and a lot of food on her, so he had evil intentions. Chu-ho remained motionless. They did not realize that she was actually awake and thought that she was sleeping soundly. Therefore, they crept closer to the bed and saw that she was using her bag as a pillow. If he wanted to take her bag, he would definitely wake her up. The two of them exchanged glances. The driver signaled with his eyes and reminded them, "Kill her." The boss nodded and cocked his gun. However, his peripheral vision inadvertently fell on Chu-ho's face. He was shocked to find that her eyes had suddenly opened. Ah! Before he could let out a coherent cry of surprise, Chu-ho suddenly jumped up from the bed and clamped his legs around his neck. With a scissor kick, he flipped him onto the ground. When the driver saw this, he reached out to snatch her bag. Chu-ho sensed the movement behind her. She glanced at him coldly from the corner of her eye and gave him a roundhouse kick. The swift and fierce kick sent him to the ground. Chapter 35-32. The boss quickly picked up the gun and loaded it. He aimed the muzzle at her back and was about to pull the trigger. However, just as she pulled the trigger, Chu-hee had already heard the sound of a gun being loaded behind her. With a sudden somersault, she dodged the bullet before he could shoot. Before the person could react, she bounced up from the ground, jumped over the big bed, and kicked her wrist, sending the gun flying away. With a backhand, Chu-hee locked his arms behind his back. Looking around, she could not find any cloth strips, so she simply broke his wrist bones with two cracking sounds. The boss cried out in pain and wailed. The pain of having his bones dislocated caused his body to twitch violently. Chu-ho ignored his screams. She reached out to grab his jaw and dislocated it. She threw him aside and walked toward the driver. A minute later, the driver's joints were also dislocated and he was thrown beside the boss. Chu-ho walked in front of the two men and gently rubbed her wrists. She said coldly, "Who are you? Why did you attack me?" We, robbery." Chu-ho narrowed her eyes dangerously. "Don't tell me you want to destroy the evidence." The two of them were so frightened by her terrifying gaze that they immediately fell silent, not daring to say another word. Chu-ho couldn't be bothered with them. She squatted down. However, this action scared the driver so much that he screamed. It was as if he was worried that she would kill them at any moment. "Don't worry, I won't kill you." Chu-ho fumbled for the car keys from the driver's body. Then she stood up, picked up her combat bag, and turned to leave. The two men were left looking at each other with cold sweat all over their bodies. Chu-ho walked out of the hotel and parked the car at the entrance. In the rain, she could vaguely see the flames in the distance. That was probably the neutral zone that had fallen. She turned on the compass and got into the car. She threw her bag on the front passenger seat and got into the driver's seat. She started the car and drove slowly in the direction of the flames. In the rain, the air was humid. Chu-ho took out a bottle of water from his bag and drank it in one gulp. He opened the window and casually threw the empty bottle out. At night, coupled with the heavy rain, visibility was very low, so she drove very slowly. They were surrounded by low hills and sparse weeds, but there was not a single person in sight. Along the way, she encountered one or two corpses lying in the middle of the road. For safety reasons, she was not sure if there was a ditch or a landslide on the side of the road. Therefore, for safety reasons, she did not go around the corpses and directly ran over them. After driving for tens of kilometers, they saw a checkpoint. There were many vehicles parked at the checkpoint, as well as a very large oil tanker. They could vaguely see a few livestock. Because of the outbreak of war, many gas stations were destroyed. Therefore, the checkpoint became an important supply station. The oil price here was very cheap because the oil resources were very rich. A liter of oil that cost 6 yuan in China only cost 60 yuan here. Even a few loaves of bread could be exchanged for a tank of oil. Oil was cheap here, but food, fruits, and fresh water were extremely expensive. Especially at a time like this, an apple was priceless. Chapter 35-33. The car drove all the way to the neutral zone. There were a total of 5 countries in North Africa. However, the neutral zone in the center was Bilibid. It was also the most prosperous area in North Africa. This place was away from the Sahara Desert and was the golden zone of North Africa. Therefore, it relied on oil and many mineral resources and was very developed. Throughout history, North Africa had always been protected by famine and plague. At the same time, there was also invasion and smoke. The car finally arrived at the border of Bilibid. After passing a few checkpoints, they were all passed by using food and US dollars. When they entered Bilibid, the intensity of the war was even more visible. The originally bustling street was now quiet and empty. On the side of the street, there were messy piles of items and corpses. Just more than 10 hours ago, the war had affected the central area. On the road, her car was stopped many times. Once, it was directly stopped by the rebel army. Chu Ho saw that they had tanks and missiles, so she obediently stopped and allowed them to check. Chu Ho got out of the car and first showed her China passport. Now that the country was strong, with this passport, it became a foolproof pass. As long as she showed her passport, she would not be troubled. Then, Chu Ho stepped aside and let them check the car. However, there were only some daily necessities in the bag and nothing else was found. When she entered the territory, she threw away the pistol in advance because she knew that if she encountered the rebel army, they would stop the car and search it. If they found the pistol, it would be disadvantageous to her. As for the food and cash, Chu Ho would not let them search, so she hid them in other corners of the car in advance. Perhaps it was because of racial advantage, most of the people in Bilibid were black. With the suppression of intelligence, they were obviously very stupid. Therefore, they did not find any food, so they let her go. It was not that Chu Ho looked down on them. The intelligence of these soldiers could make her cry. When she arrived in Bilibid, it was already dawn. She found an international hotel and made do for the day. After resting for a few hours, she continued to advance toward the center of the war. The war spread to Bilibid, and many cities in Bilibid fell. The Worth factory was one of the few cities that fell. Worth was in Jamal, Bilibid, which was dozens of kilometers away from the capital of Bilibid. She rested well, filled up her fuel tank, and set off again until she reached the border of Jamal city. As night fell, she bypassed the checkpoint and entered the city through another gap. She was quite familiar with the terrain here, so she avoided many war zones along the way and avoided many unnecessary troubles. After entering Jamal, the entire city was shrouded in the shadow of death. Smoke filled the air as the flames of war swirled in the air. Even at night, He could still see many refugees hugging their dead or injured relatives and crying in despair as she walked along the streets. Blood flowed like a river on the road. One could imagine how intense the battle was during the day. Hell on Earth, City of Despair. The embassy was located in the city center of Jamal, right next to the government building. Chu-ho relied on his memory to refer to the road signs and found the government building. However, he was shocked to see that the government building had been bombarded until it was on the verge of collapse. On the wall, there was a huge hole, mottled with blood, and the glass door had been bombed into pieces. There were countless casualties at the door, and there were piles of corpses that had not been cleaned up in time. Chapter 35-34. Even in the midst of war, in the fallen North Africa, whether it was the government or the rebel army, no one dared to touch the embassy. It was originally a local war. If the embassy was invaded, it would undoubtedly mean that the war had escalated to an international level. Chu-ho parked the car at the door, pushed the door open, and walked in. In the darkness, just as she pushed the door open, her combat boots stepped on a soft corpse. Then, in the pitch-black silence, she vaguely heard the sound of a gun being loaded. She immediately raised her hands calmly and said loudly in English, "I'm Chinese. I'm not carrying any weapons." A beam of high beam shone toward her. The strong light fell on her face and blinded her. Chu-ho calmly accepted the inspection until it was confirmed that she was a real Chinese. Finally, a light in the hall was turned on. Under the light, Chu-ho saw that countless Chinese had gathered together and were curled up in a corner, staring at her in fear. Chu-ho was shocked. She did not expect that there were still so many Chinese who had not evacuated. "Why are you still here?" "Because, the evacuation fleet has already evacuated. The next batch will only arrive in 3 days. The people in the embassy have all evacuated. We're all here waiting for rescue. Yeah, we don't dare to go out because the embassy is our last refuge. If we go out, those bullets have no eyes. It's very dangerous." It turned out that there were still many Chinese factory employees who did not manage to evacuate in time. Therefore, many people rushed into the embassy. Amidst the flames of war, the current embassy was like a refuge, as well as the last protective harbor. Although those people did not dare to invade the embassy, there were often some crazy rebels who did not care about the identity of the Chinese. They burned, killed, and robbed the stores and supermarkets opened by the Chinese. They even went to the embassy and robbed the food and water. Although it would not hurt their lives, the next batch of rescue fleet would only arrive at the port in 3 days. In other words, they had to hold on for more than 4 days. There were a lot of people, hundreds of people. Food and water were very limited. They had handed over all the cash they had. However, they could not afford food and water. Otherwise, with so many people, they could not last 4 days. Therefore, even if they were in the embassy, they did not dare to turn on the lights. They were worried that the rebels would see the light source and rush in to rob them. This place had already been robbed once and a few people were injured. Therefore, they did not dare to turn on the lights. Chu-ho heard that, frowned and asked, "In other words, the country will send another ship to take care of your evacuation?" "Yes." Then, Chu-ho took a step forward and asked, "Are there any of Werther's men here?" After a long time, a man in orange uniform stood up slowly and asked in surprise, "You're looking for Werther's men?" "Yes." Chapter 35-35. After he said this, the others were obviously trembling in fear. When Chu-ho heard this, he frowned. He had an ominous feeling in his heart. If Werther was controlled by the people of Hurricane, then what about Gu Jinglian? She scanned the crowd but did not find him. Such an eye-catching man, even if he was thrown into the crowd, he would be found at a glance. Even if she did not find him, he would stand up and show himself when he saw her. But she did not see him. This meant that he was not here. Chu-ho asked again, "You said that all of Werther's employees are here?" The man hurriedly explained, "No, only 2/3 of them are here. The other 1/3, more than 100, are trapped in the war zone." When they left Werther, the rebel army had already taken over the entire villa. That area has been sealed off by the rebel army. It's the center of the war. I'm going to find someone now. Chu Ho said again, his name is Gu Jinglian. Where is he now? Is he also trapped in the war zone? Everyone was shocked and looked at each other. The man asked in surprise, Gu Jinglian, isn't that our boss? Yes, CEO Gu, why are you looking for our boss? Chu Ho said, he's my husband. I heard that North Africa has fallen, so I came here to look for him. Chu Ho stood up straight and looked around. He said calmly, I need someone who is familiar with the terrain of Jamal to take me to the war zone to look for someone. Is anyone willing to come with me? Don't go. The man immediately said, Miss, I don't know if what you said is true. At least, I've never heard of our boss having a wife. The problem is that the war zone is now full of rebel soldiers. The streets are full of corpses and soldiers. If you go there rashly, you're not looking for someone, you're looking for death. Moreover, all of Werther's people who can come out have already come out. The rest are trapped in the middle of the war. I'm afraid their lives are uncertain. The hope of survival is very slim. If you go now, you'll be wasting your life. My man is not so weak. Your man won't die so easily. Chu Ho, on the other hand, was very confident in Gu Jinglian. Now, there was no news. That was enough to prove that he was still alive. As long as she was alive, she had a reason to take risks. No one dares to go with you. The man had a timid expression on his face as he trembled and said, those rebels are too cruel. No matter who they saw, Caucasian, Chinese, or civilian, they killed them all. What did that mean? If they went there now, they would die. It wasn't easy for us to escape from Worth. We won't risk our lives again. He did not force him to make his stance clear and resolute. After all, being afraid of death seemed to be a human instinct. After experiencing despair, the desire to survive grew stronger. All right, I'll go by myself. Chu Ho had just turned around when a young man's calm voice came from behind him. I'll go with you. Chapter 35-36. He spoke fluent Chinese and walked up to her. I grew up in Jamal, so I'm very familiar with the place. I'll go with you. Chu Ho was a little surprised. She looked behind him and asked, where are your parents? He said that he wanted to go. Perhaps he was naive, but wouldn't his parents stop him? The young man's eyes darkened, and his voice weakened. My parents are already dead. Chu Ho was stunned. The young man pursed his lips, but he didn't cry. He gritted his teeth and said, they were killed by the rebels. Chu Ho smiled. Aren't you afraid? The young man shook his head and said firmly, I'm not afraid. Anyway, my father is gone, my mother is gone, and my sister. He gritted his teeth and closed his eyes. They're gone too. I'm alone. There's nothing to be afraid of. Chu Ho seemed to see herself when she was young. In the war, her family was destroyed, and her heart was filled with hatred and helplessness. She smiled and held out her hand to him. You're so brave. Okay, come with me, but I'll protect you. The young man nodded, held her hand, and followed her out of the embassy, leaving the crowd looking at each other. When Chu Ho left the embassy, she was very cautious. She looked around and made sure that there was no one around before she opened the car door and told the young man to get in and fasten his seatbelt. She quickly got into the car, started the car, and drove in the direction of Werther. There's no one in Werther now. My father is a worker in Weert. A few days ago, Weert was occupied by a large group of armed men. According to the other uncles, they're from the Hurricane Group, not the rebel army. However, they seem to be very powerful. So many Chinese factories were smashed and robbed by the rebel army, but Weyert was the only one left unscathed. Hurricane, Chu Ho narrowed her eyes. Uncle Fu said that Hurricane Group used her and Xiao Bao to threaten Gu Jinglian to sign the agreement. He had to give up Werther and that piece of land. The losses were heavy. She still couldn't figure out why Gu Jinglian did that. Was it because of her? Was he protecting her? Thinking of this possibility, Chu Ho suddenly laughed at himself. How could this be? This man had always been arrogant and self-righteous. How could he give up such a huge benefit just to protect her? The young man continued, "It's very dangerous to drive to Werther now. However, from what I know, there are many China factories in the war zone. Those factories are all state-owned enterprises, so the rebels don't dare to touch them. Some people might be hiding there. Where do we go?" The young man pointed at the road sign in front of them. "Go to that junction and head south. You are really familiar with the terrain." The young man nodded. "I grew up here." "Then how do you speak Chinese so well?" "That's because my parents are both from China, and I'm also from China. Of course, I have to speak Chinese, but I also know a little English. If my parents were still alive, with our passports,